Reflection in the mirror. This happened when Mocha was in high school. Her school was an old building, with some parts nearly falling apart. The school had 3 main restrooms that were well maintained, but the last one was different. It was isolated from the other buildings. The floor was always filthy, and out of 6 stalls, only 3 had doors, which were barely functional. One day, Mocha found herself in a desperate situation, needing to use the restroom in the middle of class. Unfortunately, the closest option was that disgusting restroom. Since it was the nearest and she didn't want to test her luck holding it in, she had no choice but to go inside. She rushed toward the old restroom. As soon as she stepped inside, a horrible stench filled her nose, the most disgusting smell she had ever encountered. Mocha hurried into the last stall, which was much cleaner than the others, and tried her best to avoid touching the filthy floor. Afterward, Mocha went to the sink to wash her hands. The restroom was eerily silent, with only the sound of running water. Just then, she heard a faint knocking. Confused, she slowly turned off the faucet. Silence. For a moment, she thought she was imagining things, until the sound came again. She glanced at the mirror, but couldn't see anything. The surface was covered in grime. So Mocha grabbed a tissue and began wiping the mirror. Through the fading haze, she saw something moving, and then she finally saw it. Something pale, something bony. She didn't want to believe her eyes, but there it was, a hand reaching out from one of the stalls, tapping on the door. However, when Mocha quickly turned around, the fingers had vanished. Her heart pounded, but she convinced herself it was just her imagination. But that was when the nightmare began. When Mocha looked into the mirror, she was horrified, unable to believe what she was seeing. In the mirror, her reflection was smiling back at her. But it wasn't just an ordinary smile, it was distorted, grotesque. Mocha's real face was frozen in fear, lips pressed tight. But in the mirror, that was not her. And then, Mocha heard the knocking again. To her horror, she saw her reflection knocking on the mirror, trying to grab her attention, beckoning her with the other hand. It whispered, a faint sound, as if it was coming from inside her head. Come closer. At that moment, her feet felt glued to the ground. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. Then, from the corner of her eye, the stall door creaked open, inch by inch, something oozing out from within. Mocha couldn't breathe. The air in the restroom turned freezing cold. Then, a long skeletal hand emerged. Its claw-like fingers scraped against the grimy tiles, leaving deep scratches. But it didn't stop there. Behind her, another sound, a leg, a twisted limb. Its head snapped to the side like a broken doll, smiling as it crept toward her. And in the mirror, her reflection reached out, grabbing her wrist. Its sharp nails dug into her skin, pulling her toward the glass. Mocha screamed, struggling to break free from its icy grip. Overwhelmed with fear, her vision blurred. Staggering backward, she grabbed a soap dispenser and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered into countless shards, the sharp sound snapping her back to reality. She screamed. The stall door burst open. Mocha ran, stumbling, crashing onto the hallway floor. In that moment, she felt something brush against her hair from behind. In sheer panic, she ran without looking back. Back in class, Mocha tried to tell her friends about her horrifying experience, but they dismissed her, saying she was imagining things. From that day forward, no one believed her. She never returned to that restroom again, terrified of what she had seen. The memory of that day haunted her endlessly. She became paranoid about mirrors, always doubting their reflections, unable to look at them for too long, always needing to cover them up. Even to this day, Mocha does not want to know what she truly saw, but for the rest of her life, she will never forget what stared back at her from the mirror. From that day on, she developed a deep, unshakable fear of mirrors. The Echo of the Hunter. It was an afternoon. Leo had been restless all day, so he decided to take Max for a walk to a nearby field. It was spacious, airy, and peaceful. However, as they ventured deeper into the field, Leo started hearing strange noises. At first, it sounded like someone groaning, but he ignored it. Shortly after, a figure emerged from the trees. A man wearing a long black coat. Leo wondered who would wear a long coat in such hot weather. For some reason, he had a bad feeling. He quickly hid behind a tree, hoping the man hadn't seen him. He crouched down and commanded his dog to stay quiet. Thankfully, Max was always an obedient pup. The man lingered for a moment, but eventually walked away. A few minutes later, Leo could no longer hear his footsteps. He thought he was safe, but just as he started to leave with his dog, Leo heard that eerie groaning sound again behind him. At first, Leo hesitated, but he slowly turned around to see what was happening. He wished no one would ever have to experience something like this, because what he saw at that moment would become the worst nightmare of his life. He was there, standing still, staring at Leo. But this time, he wasn't alone. Beside him was a woman. Her clothes were torn and stained with something dark. Leo didn't want to think about. She was holding a knife. Her eerie smile twisted in a way that made her look completely insane.
Max, run!
Leo turned and sprinted away. He was halfway through the field when, in his frantic escape, he tripped and fell to the ground. Pain shot through his knee as he hit the ground and skidded forward. The woman's laughter echoed behind him. As he tried to get up, he realized his foot had been impaled by a shard of glass from a broken beer bottle. But there was no time. He summoned all his strength and yanked it out. It was difficult to stand and run. Leo struggled to crawl forward, knowing they had surely seen him and would catch up in no time. The woman got closer.
Leave me alone,
he screamed at them, hoping someone would hear his cries for help. But there was no one around. Max, Leo's dog, stood in front of him and began growling at the woman. Just as she moved to strike, Max lunged and sank his teeth into her leg, making her scream in agony. In retaliation, she threw his dog to the ground, injuring it severely. An uncontrollable rage surged within Leo. He got up and saw that she was wounded at the hip, so he lunged at her, causing her immense pain. But before Leo could catch his breath, a sharp pain shot through his spine. As Leo collapsed to the ground, he saw the man standing behind him. The man had stabbed him, making Leo fall, gasping for air as the world spun around him. Leo thought he was about to die, and in those final moments before closing his eyes, a gunshot rang out beside him. It was Leo's neighbor. He was holding a hunting rifle and had shot the man in the hand, making him scream in pain. Later, the neighbor told Leo that he had been out hunting and, upon reaching the field, had heard him. His hunting dogs had charged at the man and bitten him. The neighbor then rushed to help Leo stand up, but Leo insisted that he help his dog first instead of him. Then he finally passed out. When Leo woke up, he was in the hospital with his neighbor standing beside him. He told Leo that his dog had been taken to the vet and had miraculously survived. The man who attacked Leo was arrested and sent to a psychiatric hospital, but the woman didn't survive due to excessive blood loss. It turned out that they were dangerous criminals who had escaped from the mental institution together. Later, my neighbor lost his right to own firearms because he had shot someone, but he didn't care. He said he had done the right thing to save lives. Leo also felt incredibly lucky to be alive. The Curse of the Red Shirt Girl. Arthur was driving home from a friend's birthday party on a quiet night. The streets were empty. The only sound was the wind whistling through the deserted roads. As he drove, he noticed a young girl standing alone by the roadside. She had blonde hair, blue eyes, and wore a striking red coat over a white dress. To him, she looked beautiful, But as his car approached, she raised her hand, signaling for a ride. Arthur slowly pulled over and rolled down his window as she approached the car. The girl asked Arthur,
"Sir, if you don't mind, may I have a ride?"
He didn't think much of it and immediately agreed. She sat in the back seat. Feeling a little nervous, Arthur hesitantly asked her where she lived. She didn't say a word but handed him a small note. The address was written in faded ink, as if scribbled down years ago.
All right, what's your name?
Her lips barely moved as she whispered.
Mary Tellish.
A strange feeling crept over him. Something about her name seemed familiar, like a whisper from the past. Her expression never changed. He tried to ease the tension by asking about her interests. Her voice was flat.
I used to play with dolls when I was little, but I can't play with them anymore.
She smiled gently, but not in a normal way. It was unsettling, filled with sorrow.
They took them away from me.
Something about the way she spoke sent chills down Arthur's spine. They were nearing an old cemetery, its rusted iron gates glowing under the moonlight. Suddenly, Mary leaned forward. Mary asked him to stop at the cemetery gate. She placed her icy hand on his shoulder.
Please, take my coat and return it to my home as soon as possible.
For a brief moment, he swore her fingers didn't actually touch him. It was a strange, ghostly sensation. Before he could respond, she darted out of the car, heading toward the cemetery gates, leaving her red coat behind. The next day, Arthur arrived at the address. It was a large wooden house, located far in the quiet outskirts. He knocked on the door and was greeted by an elderly woman. He asked her about the woman he had met.
Ma'am, does Mary Tailish live here?
But then something unexpected happened. The woman suddenly burst into tears and invited him inside. The house was large and beautifully decorated inside. He noticed pictures of Mary. In every single one, she was wearing the same red coat. The woman began telling him about Mary. She was their daughter. One night, while she was on her way home, a group of men kidnapped her and took her away. The mother had been worried sick. 2 days later, the police found Mary's body. Her eyes and left arm were missing. Arthur was speechless. He had seen her eyes, her hands, her beating heart when she sat in his car. But in reality, Mary Tailish had been dead for years. Trying to remain calm, he handed them her coat, then left. As soon as he got into his car, he saw Mary again. But this time, she wasn't the same. She was no longer human. Her red coat still clung to her shoulders, but now it was tattered and soaked in something dark. Her eyes were hollow, her skin ashen, and she gave him a chilling smile before vanishing. Arthur tried to push it all out of his mind, but for days, he kept seeing Mary in every shadow, every reflection in the window. One night, he woke up in bed and saw her standing in the corner of his room. Her left hand was missing, a dark stain on her chest where something had been taken. She whispered,
Arthur, you helped me.
Her freezing fingers touched his forehead. Suddenly, sharp pain, screams, and the sound of something being cut open filled his mind. He saw dark figures, their shadows stretching over a struggling girl. He felt her terror. Then he saw their faces, their eyes staring directly at him. Then darkness. Arthur woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, and decided to go to the police station. He thought they'd laugh at him, but instead, they pulled out old case files. It was all real, but they had never found the suspects. The news became a major headline. Arthur had, in some way, helped bring justice for Mary Tailish. There was a legend Arthur later found online. Anyone who meets Mary Tailish must help her, or they will meet a terrible fate. Luckily, Arthur had been kind to her. The madman on the highway. This particular memory has haunted her with anxiety and panic for years. She was a single mother, working as an Amazon delivery driver to make ends meet. Lucy would drive to various delivery locations, And one time, she was on the highway near midnight. The sky was overcast. Thunder rumbled around her, but the rain had yet to begin. The low fuel light flickered as a warning. The highway stretched ahead, desolate, surrounded by dense, dark forests. Lucy checked the map and saw a gas station 15 minutes away. She decided to take her chances, skipping a crowded one of the biggest mistakes she ever made. Following the GPS directions, she turned onto a dusty road surrounded by thick woods. The road was so uneven that speeding up was nearly impossible. Then, Lucy saw him. A man stood by the roadside, dressed in tattered clothes. His scarred, filthy skin glowed under the dim light as he stared at her. Thinking he might need help, she made her second mistake. She stopped the car, just a few feet away from the man. She rolled the window down slightly and leaned out.
Are you okay, sir?
The man didn't respond, but growled instead. His voice was strange, unlike anything she had ever heard. It was a broken, animalistic howl. Lucy stepped out of the car. That was her third mistake. As soon as she exited the car, the man took a few steps forward and then stopped. Lucy asked again if he needed help, but this time, something changed. The man crouched down like a predator about to pounce. Then, grinning wickedly, he got on all fours and started crawling toward her. Before Lucy could comprehend what the hell was happening, she bolted for her car. The man began crawling at her, faster than she thought possible. He kept crawling toward her, his sinister grin stretching wider. His unblinking eyes locked onto her. Panic surged through Lucy. She could hear his shrill laughter behind her. But before he reached her, she slammed the car door shut, locked it, and fumbled with trembling hands to start the engine. The condition of the road was terrible. Lucy didn't notice the large ditch on the right. Her car suddenly sped up. The right wheel slipped into the ditch, causing a violent jolt, trapping her vehicle. Beads of sweat formed on her forehead as she looked at the dusty road ahead, surrounded by the deep forest. The only way out now was to step out of the car. The hood of the car suddenly sank. Then, he jumped onto Lucy's hood, pressing his terrifying face against the windshield, grinning savagely. Lucy gagged. The sight was too much to bear.
The man laughed, his mouth wide open, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. He whispered through the glass, his voice echoing in the air.
I'd love to torture you until you vomit blood.
Lucy's trembling fingers fumbled for her phone, dialing 911. Her voice quivered as she spoke to the dispatcher, pleading for help. She knew it would take at least 10 to 15 minutes for the police to arrive. As Lucy hung up, the man started climbing down from the hood. She checked all the doors, relieved that they were locked. He reached her window and tried to open the door. Then, he turned around and began searching for something on the ground. After a few minutes, he stopped and picked up a large rock. He hurled it at the window. The glass cracked under the impact, but did not shatter. Lucy screamed, gripping the steering wheel tightly.
Stop! Please! What did I do to you?
He just smiled, his eyes wide and wild, raising the rock again. Then, a loud sound car horns blaring, sharp and deafening. Bright headlights illuminated the crazed man. He froze, his expression turning blank, and slowly lowered the rock. The man locked eyes with Lucy one last time. He leaned closer to the window.
Looks like today is your lucky day. If you ever pass through here again, don't forget to pick me up.
He turned around and ran, disappearing into the forest. The truck pulled up beside Lucy's car, and the driver jumped out to help. The world blurred, then everything faded to black. Lucy had passed out in her car. That day, the police told Lucy they had found several abandoned vehicles left on the road by their missing owners. They had also received reports of 3 missing persons. They said they couldn't find anyone matching Lucy's description of the terrifying man. She didn't know where he was now, but for all delivery drivers and night travelers, the warning was clear: never stop for suspicious strangers. especially when driving alone in a desolate area. Elevator and warning from the 9th floor. Michael was invited for an interview at a building, hoping this would be a fresh opportunity for him. But before he stepped into the elevator, he encountered something strange. A strange man, seemingly a security guard, stopped him and sternly warned.
"Don't get off the elevator until it reaches the 9th floor,"
he said in an odd tone, completely devoid of humor. There was something in his voice that sent chills down Michael's spine, as though he was hinting at something unseen.
"Don't do anything foolish,"
he added before walking away. Michael stood frozen for a moment, convincing himself it was just an absurd warning, yet he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at him. Michael stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 9th floor. A soft chime echoed in the elevator, announcing each floor through the intercom, as if trying to ease his tension. When the elevator stopped at the 5th floor, Michael sensed something unusual. The sliding doors revealed a receptionist sitting at a desk. She looked at him and smiled warmly.
"Good morning, Michael."
She greeted, leaving Michael stunned. What surprised him was the way she addressed him, as though she had known him for a long time, even though they had never met before. She spoke about his personal life, even recounting intimate details Michael had never shared with anyone. Leaning forward, she added,
"We know everything."
and then smiled in a cryptic way. The doors closed before he could respond, and the elevator shuddered as it ascended. When the elevator reached the 11th floor, the doors opened, and an elderly woman stepped inside. She glanced at Michael, then turned back to stare at the elevator buttons. She said firmly,
"I want to go to the 2nd floor."
However, Michael objected, advising her against going there.
"Nonsense."
Pressing the button for the 2nd floor herself. When the elevator doors opened, it revealed what looked like a decayed, damp cave with slick walls oozing black water that seemed alive. The faint flickering lights only added to the eerie atmosphere. Michael stepped back, avoiding eye contact with the woman, but she was unfazed, stepping out as though this was where she belonged. Then she turned back, smiled, and asked,
"Aren't you coming?"
Michael panicked, frantically pressing the close button on the elevator. The woman slowly walked into the darkness, as if vanishing into thin air. But things did not end there. As the doors were about to close, a shadowy figure suddenly appeared, stopping the elevator doors with a bony hand. It was a man in a black suit with glowing red eyes.
"Where are you rushing off to?"
Michael stepped back, trying to maintain distance.
I'm not planning to get off on this floor. I'm heading to the 9th floor.
Then the man spoke about offering him a lucrative deal if he stayed. Michael frowned, his instincts warning him that this was far from good.
I don't need anything from you.
"Oh, but I think you'll change your mind,"
the man said, stepping closer.
"Trade your eyes for eternal peace. You won't have to see any horrors again. A life free from pain, free from fear."
Michael froze as he stared into the man's cold gaze and realized that he had no eyes, just deep, empty black sockets. Michael felt a fog enveloping his mind, and before he realized it, he was stepping forward. But just as his hand was about to touch, a sound echoed from afar, snapping Michael back to reality.
No, I don't want that. I'll face it on my own.
The man's demeanor changed suddenly. His smile disappeared, replaced by a cold, sharp glare. He moved quickly toward Michael, arms outstretched, as if to pull him out of the elevator. The man grabbed his collar, yanking him off balance. Michael felt his foot slip off the edge of the elevator, stepping halfway into the dark void of the 2nd floor. Michael grabbed the elevator railing and used all his strength to pull himself back. The man lost his balance and let go. Without wasting a second, Michael slammed the close door button. The elevator doors slowly shut, leaving the man standing in the darkness with a twisted smile.
"You can't run forever, Michael."
The elevator continued to ascend. The buttons for the lower floors gradually disappeared from the control panel. He tried pressing a button, but the elevator did not respond. Then the TV screen switched to live footage of Michael, lying on the elevator floor, wearing a strange and unsettling smile. In panic, the elevator filled with a distorted version of the song Happy Birthday. When the elevator suddenly stopped at the 9th floor, the doors opened to reveal what seemed to be a normal reception area. Michael hesitated. The warmth of the room seemed to beckon him, but something about it felt too perfect. Then she stood there, pressing something that resembled a control panel, before vanishing in the blink of an eye. At that moment, he began to realize that he had stepped into an invisible labyrinth. Everything around him became hazy, and the scene seemed to unfold in an endless loop. The elevator descended to the 1st floor where he had entered. As he stepped out, he felt a brief sense of relief, only to witness someone else stepping into the elevator. As the doors closed, Michael instinctively warned the woman.
Don't step out until you reach the 9th floor.
The door shut, and the elevator began its ascent once again. Midnight flight. Due to his job, Lucas frequently traveled for business to meet clients. He was sitting alone at the airport, waiting for a late-night flight back to Sydney. The clock showed 1 a.m. The area where he was seated was almost deserted, except for a few scattered passengers. Lucas had his headphones on and was engrossed in his phone. The atmosphere felt strangely empty for such a usually busy airport. At that moment, a flight attendant, a woman in uniform with an eerie, unsettling smile, approached him and gently tapped him on the shoulder.
Sir, your flight is about to depart. I think you missed the announcement.
Lucas glanced around and realized he was the only one left in the waiting area. The elderly couple had already left, and there were no other passengers. His flight was scheduled for 1:30 a.m., but it was already 1:15 a.m. He quickly stood up and thanked her, surprised at how fast time had passed. Lucas got up and began following her. As they walked through the airport, he noticed something odd. She seemed to walk with an uneven gait. Then, he noticed a deep scar on her left leg, and her skin looked unusually pale. She led him onto the plane, and as he stepped inside, he was stunned to see that the entire plane was packed with passengers, none of whom he had noticed or seen in the waiting area. The atmosphere inside the plane was eerily silent, so much so that for a moment, he thought no one was breathing. The passengers sat with their heads bowed, not talking, almost motionless. After boarding, she leaned close and whispered in his ear.
Please take your seat, sir.
If he had been alone, he might have screamed. The cold, chilling breath in her whisper made his ears feel frozen. Lucas went to his seat by the window. As he sat down, he noticed a thin man in formal attire seated next to him, but there was something off about his face. Lucas felt the plane was unusually cold, and soon, a foul stench began to permeate the air around him. Lucas fastened his seatbelt and waited for the plane to take off, but none of the other passengers moved or changed their behavior. They all remained silent and expressionless. He told the man next to him,
It's so cold in here.
The man didn't reply. He just sat there with his head bowed. Lucas thought maybe he was asleep or didn't want to talk. Then all the lights began flickering. Suddenly, the emergency alarm blared, and the plane started shaking violently. Lightning flashed across the sky outside. A violent jolt caused luggage to fall from the overhead compartments. He screamed, but the man next to him and everyone else showed no signs of panic. They all sat like statues, seemingly indifferent to what was happening. In a panic, Lucas tried to unbuckle his seatbelt, but it was stuck. Desperate, he shouted for help. Then, he turned to the man next to him, saying,
Excuse me, please wake up. This plane is going to crash. Please, we need to do something, or we're all going to die.
As Lucas struggled, the man next to him slowly looked up. His face was horrifying, with one side severely burned and scarred. He smiled, a chilling, terrifying grin, and said,
"They're all dead."
The other passengers now revealed grotesque faces. A spine-chilling, sinister laughter erupted from all of them. They began laughing in unison, a shrill, terrifying sound. "Please let me off," he begged. At that moment, his seatbelt came undone, and he ran toward the exit to escape. But the flight attendant suddenly appeared, blocking his path. Her face was now unrecognizable, her body covered in wounds, smeared with blood, and she had a wide, menacing grin. He shoved the flight attendant aside and ran toward the cockpit, hoping to find the pilots. When he opened the door, he was met with a horrifying sight. Both pilots were gone, and everything inside was engulfed in flames. His vision began to blur, his head throbbed, and the faint sound of devilish laughter echoed in his ears.
"Sir, are you okay?"
The voice startled Lucas awake. It was a security guard at the airport, leaning down to check on him. He slowly sat up, his body trembling, and looked around. He was no longer on the plane. Instead, Lucas was lying next to the charred wreckage of what looked like an old airplane. The air was thick with the smell of burnt metal and something worse. The guard told him that this area was restricted.
That plane had been struck by lightning a week ago, and everyone on board, including the flight attendants and pilots, had perished.
Shocked, Lucas stammered that he had been on that plane. He looked at the plane, horrified by what he had just experienced. He knew he had narrowly escaped the dark fate that had befallen the passengers of that ill-fated flight. The lurking in the middle of the night. This happened to Joy when she was in college. Joy lived alone in her dorm, and it was just an ordinary day like any other. After class, she decided to stop by the nearest grocery store to pick up a few things before heading home. As she walked through the aisles, browsing items, she noticed a strange man lurking in one of them. He was a man with bloodshot eyes and tattered clothes, staring at her from a distance with a strange, unsettling grin. As she continued shopping, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her. Joy tried to ignore it and quickly grabbed what she needed before heading to the checkout. But as she reached the checkout, she felt his breath on her neck. He leaned in close and whispered something in her ear, something she couldn't quite make out. Joy quickly paid for her items and rushed to her car in the parking lot. As Joy was about to get into her car, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning around, she saw it was him. He had come from the store and was now charging toward her, a knife in his hand. Joy threw herself into her car, locking the doors just in time, escaping by mere seconds. He stood outside, pounding on the window, shouting obscenities. But she sped off and called the police once she was safe. The police searched the area, but couldn't find the man. Joy was terrified and couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching her. One night, a violent storm rolled in. Joy struggled to sleep and woke up around 5 or 6 a.m., startled by a particularly loud clap of thunder that shook the house. Then, she noticed a strange shadow. As lightning flashed, she saw the silhouette of a man standing outside her window, his face pressed against the glass, staring at her. It was him, the man from the store. Joy froze in terror. In his hand, he clutched a knife, his gaze fixed on her. With each flash of lightning, the man appeared closer until, suddenly, he vanished along with the storm. Panicked, Joy rushed to check that all the doors were locked. But when she turned back, she saw the man standing in her living room. His terrifying grin widened as he pointed the knife at her and lunged forward, screaming,
"You're mine! You're mine!"
Joy collapsed to the floor, paralyzed with fear, as he climbed on top of her, the blade of his knife slicing through her clothes. Just when she thought it was over, a loud crash echoed through the room, and she saw him collapse to the floor. Then, Joy saw her neighbor. He had tackled the man, pinning him down and punching him repeatedly until he was unconscious. A wave of relief washed over Joy. She asked her neighbor how he knew she was in danger. He explained that while going to his kitchen for a drink of water, he saw the man lurking around the building through his window. Sensing something was wrong, he decided to watch from a distance to see what would happen. The man was arrested. He had just been released after serving 30 years in prison for attempted murder and assault. The entire ordeal left her traumatized, and for months, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Joy continued to have nightmares about the man who had nearly taken her life that night. If it weren't for her neighbor, things could have ended very differently. Stalker at the bus stop. A quiet and snowy Sunday evening. I was sitting at the bus stop, looking at my phone, and realized I had missed my bus. I started to shiver as the weather grew colder. Time passed slowly. I pulled out my phone again, put on my earphones, and selected a song to forget the uncomfortable cold. I looked around, realizing I was completely alone. No cars, no pedestrians, just an endless, empty street. Nearly an hour went by, and the bus was still nowhere in sight. I checked my phone again. The screen showed no updates on the bus's arrival, and the battery was dangerously low. A while later, I sensed some movement. A man wrapped in several layers of thick clothing, his face obscured by a knitted hood. The man walked with a strange, almost unsteady gait, as if he wasn't sure where he was going. I froze but tried to focus on my phone, not wanting to draw attention. The man approached the bus stop and sat at the opposite end of the bench. My discomfort grew. I glanced at the man, noticing part of his face exposed under the hood, a gaunt, pale face with eyes that seemed unfocused, distant. The man was muttering something to himself, his words slurred and incoherent. I shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something was off about this person. He moved closer, almost imperceptibly at first, but with each subtle shift, he inched toward me. My unease turned into panic as the man continued to slide closer, his gaze fixed on me in a strange, unsettling way. I felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, I felt the man's presence right next to me. The tension was unbearable. I quickly stood up, grabbed my bag, and started walking away from the bus stop. The man, still sitting there, tilted his head to the side, his eyes never leaving me as I walked away. I quickly walked away. I reached the next bus stop and finally felt somewhat relieved. I began to sit down slowly, letting my guard down a little as I waited for the bus. I closed my eyes for a moment, exhausted. The quiet of the falling snow was almost peaceful. Suddenly, a loud and rapid knock shattered the silence. My eyes shot open, my heart racing, and I slowly turned around to see the man from the previous bus stop, standing on the other side of the glass, his face pressed against it, grinning maniacally. His eyes were wide, staring straight at me without blinking. He kept knocking on the glass, his breath fogging up the surface. Panic flooded my body. I quickly stood up and backed away from the glass. The man began moving, circling around, his gait more erratic than before. His footsteps grew closer. I backed away, yelling at the man to stay away. However, the man was undeterred. He raised his hand, reaching out as if to do something to me. Luckily, I reacted just in time, darting off the sidewalk as the man lunged toward me. In a strange, inexplicable way, he slipped forward, his face slamming hard into the cold, icy pavement. I sound was horrifying. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It was so bizarre. I watched in horror as blood began to pool around the man's face, staining the snow with a deep red. My mind raced as I tried to process what had just occurred. I crouched down, attempting to get a response from him, but there was none. I sat down on the curb, my hands trembling as I pulled out my phone and called for help. The snow continued to fall, turning this bus stop into a place of horror and dread for me. The flashing lights of the ambulance and police car pierced through the night. Paramedics rushed to the man's side, but it was clear that something was very wrong with him. As the paramedics searched the man's belongings, they found a photograph in his wallet, a picture of the man with a boy who looked eerily similar to me. The police explained that the man had been on prescription drugs after losing his son, and his mental state had deteriorated ever since. I realized, with disbelief, that the man may have mistaken me for his lost son. A few days later, I took my driving test. As I drove, I glanced down the road where the bus stop was in the distance, the events of that night still haunting me deeply. I couldn't shake the sorrow of the man's grief and the terrifying experience that had unfolded. Mysterious driver in the desert. Gavi was driving down an empty desert highway, stretching for miles, barren and silent. He had been driving for hours. The only sound was the crackling of his car's radio, which seemed to be breaking down, with only static and the occasional country tune. This was one of the rare times Gavi passed through here. He glanced at his dashboard map. No towns, no gas stations for miles. Just an empty, desolate road. As Gavi approached a small hill on the road, he felt a sense of relief. The slight slope broke the endless flatness, providing a brief change. But as he went downhill, something caught his attention in the distance. At first, he couldn't tell what it was. Just a shape, a dark figure faintly illuminated by the moonlight. But as he got closer, the figure took form a person standing on the side of the road. Gavi slowed down, squinting to get a better look. It was a woman, standing alone in the middle of nowhere. She wore a long white dress and had pale skin. Her long black hair hung over her face as if soaked in water. Gavi muttered, wondering what she was doing out here. There was nothing for miles. No cars, no houses. How did she even get here? Gavi slowed the car further, considering whether to stop. Maybe she was lost. But as he got closer, something sent a chill down his spine. Her hair looked too wet, as if she had just walked out of a rainstorm, even though the desert had been dry for weeks. And her face, what little he could see of it, her eyes were too large, unblinking, staring straight at Gavi through the wet strands of hair. He hit the gas, speeding past her in fear. Even though he tried to convince himself she was just a lost traveler or perhaps a prank, Gavi couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Minutes passed, and Gavi continued driving through the endless desert, the eerie calm returning. He kept glancing in the rear-view mirror, feeling as if someone was watching him. He shook his head, trying to stay focused, but then Gavi saw another hill in the distance, just like the one he had passed earlier. And after a short drive, there she was again. The same woman, the same white dress, the same wet hair covering her face. But this time, she was closer to the road, and her smile was even wider, more unnatural. Gavi couldn't believe his eyes. How could she have gotten here before him? There was no way she could have moved that fast. He didn't think twice and slammed his foot on the gas, speeding forward to get past her. This time, Gavi didn't dare look back. Another hill appeared ahead, and the familiar fear tightened in Gavi's chest. He didn't want to go over it, didn't want to see her again. But he had no choice. His worst fear came true. She was there again, standing and waving at him. Her smile now impossibly wide, stretching nearly from ear to ear, and her cold, soulless eyes stared directly at Gavi. Maybe she was some sort of hallucination conjured by his imagination. No matter how much he tried, the fear continued to gnaw at him. He had heard the stories of haunted highways, of strange ghosts appearing to night travelers, but he had never believed them until now. He couldn't keep driving and needed to stop to escape this cursed road. But there was no exit, no rest stop. Gavi felt trapped with no way out. And then, the radio started crackling again. He reached out with a trembling hand to adjust the dial. But before he could turn it off, Gavi felt something cold touch the back of his neck. He froze. Reaching from behind the driver's seat was a pair of pale white hands. The fingers wrapped around his face, slowly digging their nails into his skin. Gavi was now about to face something he didn't understand, and he still had a secret he was hiding. Mysterious driver in the desert. Those fingers, they were slowly tightening around Gavi's face. They were icy cold. Cold like the touch of death itself. He was frozen in place. Slowly, with fear creeping down his spine, he turned to look. Gavi couldn't see the face those hands belonged to, but he had the sense it was a woman. Was it the woman? The one he'd passed many times on the highway? His mind was flooded with horror. The car swerved violently as the grip on him tightened. The tires screeched against the road. The car was losing control. The car veered off the highway, crashing into the rocky terrain with a sharp, grating sound. The impact was brutal, throwing him against the steering wheel as the airbag deployed. Pain surged through his body. Gavi's head hit the window, and for a moment, everything seemed to blur. Smoke rose from the crumpled hood, the headlights flickering dimly on the dark horizon. Gavi's vision swam as he tried to focus. He was still alive. Gavi could feel blood trickling down one side of his face. His limbs were heavy, weighed down. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. Then, he blacked out. In the distance, a car approached. The officer, a seasoned man who had seen his share of accidents, stepped out of his vehicle, his flashlight cutting through the desert's dark night. The car was a wreck. Twisted metal and shattered glass scattered across the rocky ground. Smoke still rose from the engine. The officer cautiously approached. The officer, Jay, shone his flashlight through the driver's side window. His eyes widened in shock when he saw the body still strapped into the seatbelt. After checking the license plate, he realized it was someone named Gavi. His head was twisted at a strange angle, almost wrenched to the side, and his eyes wouldn't close, wide open as if staring right at me. His face frozen in a horrifying grimace, blood smeared across his skin. But just as Jay started to step back, he heard something. A sound like someone crying, but it was muffled, as if something was blocking their mouth. The sound came from the trunk. At first, it was faint, barely audible. But as Jay leaned in to investigate, it grew louder, more desperate. It was a sobbing, painful cry, like that of a child trapped inside. Panic surged through the officer as he ran to the back of the car. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the trunk latch. Jay's mind raced with questions. Who could be inside? What had happened? 2 cases at once? The trunk lid sprang open. Jay's flashlight illuminated a haunting sight inside the cramped trunk, a little girl. A young girl, bound and gagged. Her wrists and ankles were tied tightly with thick, rough rope, and her mouth was sealed with tape. Tears streamed down her pale face, her eyes wide with fear. Not just that clutched tightly to her chest was a doll. The doll wore a white dress, its skin pale and cracked with age, its face fixed in a disturbingly wide smile. Large, dark eyes stared back, and its long black hair appeared wet, hanging loose. Jay reached out to touch the doll, and then its head moved. The girl sobbed, her body trembling as she clung to the doll. Jay staggered back, the weight of the doll's gaze pressing on him. He turned away, his breath becoming ragged, his heart pounding in his chest. The officer fought back his rising panic. It was just a coincidence, he told himself. He quickly untied the girl and removed the tape from her mouth. She gasped for air, sobbing loudly. Jay reassured the girl and led her to his patrol car. He called for backup. From the moment they got into the car, the doll sat there, staring at him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him, studying him with its eerie and unsettling gaze. Soon after, backup and paramedics arrived. The girl was taken to the hospital, still clutching the doll, which baffled him. Her small hands clung to it as if it were the only thing tethering her. As the ambulance drove away, Jay remained haunted by the strange presence of the doll. He pondered the mysterious events leading up to the crash. Even though the girl had been rescued, the story felt far from over. It seemed to have slipped beyond Jay's understanding, perhaps into another world entirely. The haunting of the abandoned station. It was a chilly autumn evening in our small town. Inside the diner, warmth enveloped me. Sarah, my girlfriend, was finishing her cup of coffee. We had been dating for a few months, and tonight seemed like the perfect opportunity for an adventure since we both enjoyed that. After dinner, we decided to explore the old abandoned train station in town. The train station loomed before us. Built in the early 1900s, it had once been the heart of our town, but now it lay in ruins, overtaken by nature. My heart raced, but I didn't want to show fear in front of Sarah. I reassured her, even though I felt a hint of doubt creeping in. She began glancing around nervously and told me she felt something was off. Then, from afar, we heard a faint whistle echoing through the air. Sarah asked me, "There are no trains running here anymore, right?" I only knew that no trains had run here for decades. The whistle grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of wheels clattering on metal tracks. Sarah tightened her grip on my arm. "We need to go right now," she urged, panic rising in her voice. But somehow I lost control, as if mesmerized by the sound, stepping closer to the edge of the platform, staring down the empty tracks. The sound grew louder, yet no train was in sight, just the tracks stretching infinitely into the darkness. Then, as if summoned from nowhere, a blinding beam of light appeared, racing toward us. It approached quickly, gliding down the tracks like a ghost, but something was off. That light wasn't attached to any train. It hovered. Sarah screamed, urging me to stop, pulling me back just as the invisible train roared past. Its force nearly knocked us over, the platform shaking violently. For a moment, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, the station was silent again, the air heavy and still. Distant sounds returned, but something had changed. Sarah was gone. "Sarah," I called, panic rising within me. I searched for her frantically. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing on the tracks, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, its eyes glowing red like embers in the dark. A chill ran down my spine as it raised its hand, pointing down the tracks. Far down the tracks, I saw Sarah, walking away from me. But she wasn't walking normally. Her movements were stiff, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. "Sarah, stop," I yelled. But my voice echoed back, swallowed by the night. I ran toward her, desperation driving each of my steps. The closer I got, the more horrific reality became. Her face was blank, expressionless, her eyes vacant and soulless. It was as if her very soul had been drained. Tears streamed down my face as I reached for her, but the distance between us never closed. The shadowy figure at the station let out a raspy laugh, echoing through the trees, sending waves of fear crashing over me. I turned to face the figure, but it had vanished. In its place stood an old, rusted, decaying train, its windows shattered. Shadowy figures filled the cars, their hollow eyes staring at me. The door creaked open, like an invitation into the darkness. My heart raced with fear and curiosity. A whisper brushed my ear. "Join us. We've always been here waiting for you." I shook my head, backing away, but the pull of the train was too strong. My legs moved on their own, drawing me toward the door. Just as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. The train swayed, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I turned to see Sarah sitting across from me, her eyes vacant. "What's happening?" I choked out, but she didn't respond. Instead, she slowly raised her hand and pointed out the window. I looked outside. I was standing on the platform, staring at the train. But how could this be? I was inside. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The train raced faster and faster, the outside world fading into a blur in whispers. Suddenly, it stopped, and the door creaked open. Then, that dark figure appeared inside the train, leaning in close, its cold breath chilling me to the bone. "You should never have come here," it whispered, and everything went dark. When I awoke, I was lying on the cold ground, the train and station gone. All that remained was an empty field overgrown with weeds, a stark contrast to the horror I had just endured. I stood up, dazed and disoriented, and headed back to town. As I neared the town square, something caught my eye, a missing person poster. It was Sarah's face, but the date was from 10 years ago. My heart sank as I stumbled back, trying to comprehend the horror. Had I really been gone for 10 years? Or had Sarah vanished long before I ever met her? The truth was too horrific to grasp. Desperate for answers, I rushed back to the station, but when I arrived, it was gone. Only an empty field remained. The train, the darkness, the station all vanished as if they had never existed. Memories flooded back the faces of victims, broken families, the whispers of those who had vanished without a trace. Each shadow symbolized a haunting reminder of what I had escaped, of the guilt I carried for failing to protect those who needed me most. I turned away and walked on, ready to embrace the memories instead of fleeing from them. The shadows may linger, but I would no longer let them control my life. The kidnapper's scary plan. Lily was on her way home from her best friend Emma's house. Emma's house was on a hill, and despite Emma urging Lily to stay over, she decided to head home. It was only 7:30 p.m., and she decided to take the bus. At the nearby bus stop, she arrived and saw a man already sitting there. He looked a bit strange, appearing to be homeless. The man's unsettling presence made Lily uncomfortable. She decided to keep her distance and stood there with a serious expression. Emma called her to ask if she had boarded the bus yet. Lily talked to her for a while, trying to ease the discomfort caused by the man's presence. Despite trying to ignore him, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that the man was watching her. Every 5 to 10 seconds, he would take out his phone and appear busy texting. After ending the call, Lily glanced at her phone. It was 7:45 p.m., and her battery was down to 10%. She sighed, annoyed that she hadn't charged it earlier. She stared at the long, empty highway, but there was no sign of the bus. She felt uneasy being alone with the strange man. Then the man stood up from his seat and started walking toward Lily. She looked away, trying to focus on her phone screen as he approached her.
"Hey, got a lighter?"
Without looking up, Lily curtly replied,
I don't smoke.
She could hear him moving behind her, but didn't dare to turn around. A moment later, she turned around, and he was standing right in front of her. His eyes stared at her vacantly, and his smile was eerie, grotesque.
Are you sure? All girls pretend they don't like attention, but they all love it.
Leave me alone.
She yelled loudly, threatening that if he didn't back off, she would scream and call the police, warning him that her friend's house was nearby and her friend's dad owned a gun. His smile vanished, and she thought she was safe. Then headlights appeared as a car pulled up, driven by an older woman who offered Lily a ride. Surprised but not hesitating, Lily seized the chance to escape the unsettling situation. She quickly got into the car without a second thought, leaving the man behind. As the car drove away, Lily saw the man smiling in the rearview mirror, and his expression sent chills down her spine. They drove off, and the woman smiled as Lily thanked her. But her friendly demeanor seemed odd when she turned to Lily and said,
"Women need to be careful these days. You never know when you'll walk into a trap."
The woman drove slowly along the dark highway. After a while, they stopped at a deserted gas station parking lot. Lily watched the woman step out and shut the car door behind her. Lily wanted to call her parents to let them know, but she remembered her phone was dead. Just then, a ringtone sounded, and her eyes fell on a phone lying casually on the dashboard. She thought the woman must have forgotten it. She cautiously reached out to grab it. The phone unlocked without needing a password. At that moment, a wave of dread washed over her. The phone's wallpaper flashed on the screen, showing a picture of the woman standing next to a man. He was the same man Lily had seen at the bus stop. Somehow, they were connected. Panicked, she quickly grabbed the phone and slipped out of the car, but not fast enough. The woman returned, her kind expression gone, blocking the door.
"Where do you think you're going, girl?"
Lily stumbled, slipping through the driver's side door to get out. As she escaped, the woman circled around the back of the car, brandishing a knife to block her path. The woman lunged at her, and instinctively, Lily raised her arm to shield herself, causing the blade to slice painfully across her skin. Lily turned to run, but the woman grabbed her hair and yanked her back. Lily screamed, twisting and clawing at her hand. Blood dripped down her arm, her strength fading from the injury. But then, a surge of survival instinct kicked in. Lily stomped and kicked at the woman's shin, making her stumble and giving Lily a brief chance to escape. As Lily sprinted toward the road, headlights appeared in the distance. It was a truck. Desperate, she waved frantically, hoping they would stop. The truck slowed down as they saw her. The woman stood just behind her and yelled,
"She's stealing from me. Stop her."
A man stepped out. Lily could only cry out.
She's lying. She tried to kidnap me.
He hesitated, but the sight of Lily's bleeding arm seemed to convince him. She quickly got into his truck, and they headed to the police station. Luckily, she had evidence, her phone. It was a treasure trove of proof. They were kidnappers preying on women and children. They had a twisted scheme. The man would harass women, and the woman would pretend to be a savior. Once inside the car, the victim had no escape. Luckily, Lily avoided becoming their next victim. Months later, she still thought about that night. Since then, Lily had bought a car and vowed never to take public transportation alone at night again. The Cursed Game. The Willis family's house, her neighbors, stood quietly at the end of a dimly lit street. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the neighborhood. Lily, who had done many jobs before, was starting her first day babysitting this time. The cozy living room was scattered with toys. Lily was greeted by Angie, a curious little girl. After listening to the parents' instructions and seeing them leave, The house was left to the two of them, growing silent. Angie leaned forward, her eyes lighting up mischievously.
Let's play a game. Call Mary.
Lily froze, letting out a nervous giggle. Angie tugged on Lily's sleeve, her wide eyes pleading.
Please, Lily. Just this once? I won't ask for anything else.
Lily hesitated, but Angie's persistence made her relent. Angie explained to Lily that they had to go into the bathroom, turn off all the lights, and say her name 3 times in front of the mirror. If they did, Mary would appear. They must not let the candle go out. Lily didn't really believe it and thought it was just a made-up game. The bathroom was dimly lit by flickering candles. Lily stood in front of the mirror. She took a deep breath and said,
All right, just this once.
And they'd go to bed. She called the woman's name. Before she could finish, Angie gasped and backed away, saying she didn't want to play anymore. Lily reassured her, saying it was fine, just a game, and it would end now. Then they'd go back to the room, just as they were about to leave. But then the candles suddenly went out. The room plunged into darkness. An icy chill swept over them. Lily led Angie out of the bathroom, but the house lights flickered erratically. From the bathroom, a soft whisper echoed throughout the house. Lily froze. Angie began to tear up and asked her,
What's that sound?
Before Lily could react, a figure, a woman, emerged from the bathroom, her hollow black eyes and mouth oozing a horrifying black sludge. Clutching Angie's hand, she began to step back. Together, they ran and hid in the dining room. Lily tried to turn on the lights, but they didn't work. It was as if they were trapped in another world. Lily pulled Angie under the dining table to hide from the ghost's pursuit. Through the gap beneath the tablecloth, Angie saw her bare feet shuffling closer. The floor creaked with each step. Lily ran to the bathroom. She quickly grabbed the matchbox from her pocket and lit the candles. Her hands trembled as she tried, but the flame refused to catch. It was too late. Behind Lily, she appeared, her distorted smile widening as she raised a pair of scissors. Lily panicked, dropping the matchbox and crawling backward, sobbing as she begged for mercy in vain. When Lily locked eyes with her, she felt pain engulf her entire body. She could do nothing but stare, the feeling worse than death. As the scissors slowly moved toward Lily's body, ready to tear through her skin and claim her life, Lily thought it was over. Then she heard the cry of a child. Suddenly, the lights came back on. Angie stood holding a candle and screamed.
Leave her alone.
Seeing this, Lily chanted her name 3 times to end the game. The candles suddenly flared to life. A piercing scream shook the house as she dissolved into a cloud of black smoke. Angie clung tightly to her.
She's gone, right?
Lily nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the dark bathroom door. The Willis parents returned to find Angie asleep, with every light in the house on. Lily managed a tired smile. That day was Lily's first and last day as a babysitter. She had seen many things in her life, but nothing compared to what happened that night. Even if you don't believe, don't take the risk. The strange man in the vacant lot. Lucas and his fiancée, Emily, decided to spend a weekend getaway at Lucas's family cabin deep in the woods. They enjoyed outdoor activities like hiking, fishing, and four-wheeling, making the most of the peaceful atmosphere the cabin provided. On the last day, Emily and Lucas's family decided to leave early, while the couple chose to stay behind for some quiet time before heading home that evening. As the sun set, Lucas and Emily packed their belongings into the truck and began driving down the dirt road leading out of the property. The road was surrounded by dense forest, and they had to pass through 5 gates along the way, each secured with a lock that Lucas had to unlock and relock as they passed. When they reached the 4th gate, something felt different. It was located in a large clearing, allowing the landscape to be clearly visible under the moonlight. Still, Something about it unsettled him, as if an unseen threat lurked nearby. He unlocked the gate and drove through, but as he turned back to lock it again, he noticed a strange light in the distance. A flashlight beam flickered through the trees, and the silhouette of a man appeared. Lucas hesitated, watching the figure for a moment, but dismissed it, assuming it was just another property owner. However, just as Lucas began locking the gate, he heard a voice calling for help. Squinting into the darkness, he called out,
"Hey, are you okay?"
and slowly stepped toward the flashlight. At that moment, the flashlight jerked wildly in all directions. Lucas could see the figure sprinting toward them, but the man wasn't shouting, he was just running. The man was dressed in dark clothing and carried a backpack. Panic surged through Lucas, and he rushed back to the truck. He jumped in and sped off, trying to stay calm, telling Emily that he had just been startled. He drove about a quarter of a mile before reaching the final gate. Putting the truck in park, he hesitated for a moment, glancing back toward where he had seen the man. Seeing nothing, he stepped out and walked toward the gate. Then, in the distance, a flickering light appeared again. It was him. The man was coming. He appeared once again, sprinting toward them. Summoning his courage, Lucas shouted,
"Do you need help?"
hoping the man would stop and respond. But nothing changed. But this time, he didn't run toward Lucas like before. Instead, he charged straight at the truck where Emily was sitting. She was in danger. Emily, now seeing the man in the rearview mirror, asked Lucas to check if he needed help. Lucas called back, revealing his earlier encounter, and they both realized the man was likely chasing them. This was a serious threat.
Lucas, we have to go.
Emily screamed. Emily shrieked as the man sprinted toward the truck, grabbing the door handle and yanking it violently, trying to force it open. Lucas acted on instinct. He rushed to the back of the truck, yanked open the toolbox, and grabbed a tire iron. He swung the metal bar down onto the man's wrist with a sickening crack. The man let out a pained scream. He stumbled backward, his arm hanging limply at his side. But instead of running, he just smiled, a twisted, unsettling grin. And then, he stepped forward again. Lucas jumped back into the truck, slammed the door shut, and floored the gas. The truck shot forward, kicking up dirt as they sped through the final gate. Emily twisted in her seat, looking out the back window in terror. "What the hell just happened?" she asked. But Lucas had no answer. He had no idea what or who that man was. Lucas glanced at the rearview mirror. The man stood in the middle of the road, not running, not moving, just smiling. When they reached the main highway, Lucas called his father and told him what had happened. His father had never seen anyone act like that in the area before. The next day, an uncle visited the cabin, but found no trace of the strange man. And to this day, they have never discovered his identity or his motive why he did what he did. Fake stalkers. This happened a few years ago. Liz was home alone for the weekend while her parents attended a wedding, and she had invited a friend over, Maya. Maya, who lived just behind Liz's house, agreed to come over. Liz prepared snacks and tea, looking forward to a fun and relaxing day. About 20 minutes later, the doorbell rang. However, it wasn't a normal ring. The person at the door was pressing it urgently, as if in a hurry. When she reached the door and asked,
"Who's there?"
a rushed voice responded,
Maya.
When Liz opened the door, she saw Maya standing there, looking disheveled and breathless. She rushed inside, visibly shaking with fear. Liz quickly led her inside and handed her a glass of water, then asked what had happened. Maya explained that while walking to Liz's house, she had noticed a man staring at her, smiling. Although she tried to ignore him and keep walking, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was following her. She turned around to check if the man was still there, and he was following her. Panicked, she ran to Liz's house, hoping to lose him. But by the time she arrived, the man had vanished, Liz reassured her friend that she was safe inside. They carried on with their plans for the day, but Maya remained uneasy, unable to shake off the fear from her encounter. After a while, both girls got hungry and decided to order a pizza. About half an hour later, the doorbell rang. Liz assumed it was the pizza delivery, so she got up to answer it. Liz walked toward the door.
Who is it?
She called, gripping the doorknob.
Pizza delivery, ma'am.
Just as she was about to turn the knob, a piercing scream from upstairs shattered the silence. Maya suddenly screamed from upstairs.
Liz, don't open the door.
Her voice filled with panic. Maya rushed down the stairs, yanking Liz away from the door with terrifying force. Liz barely had time to process what was happening before she was pulled back. Startled and confused, she demanded to know what was going on. With fear in her eyes, Maya began explaining everything. She said she had looked out the window and saw the same man who had followed her earlier. Now, he was standing at the door, waiting for them to open it. She believed he had been stalking them and was impersonating the pizza delivery man. Liz hesitated, wondering if Maya was overreacting. Maybe she was just paranoid after all. It was nearly impossible to see his face clearly in the darkness. Maya gripped her wrist tightly, her face pale as she saw Liz stepping toward the door.
Liz, don't. I saw him. It's him. It's the same man.
She took a step toward the door. The man spoke.
I saw you run. Don't leave. Open the door and take your pizza.
Liz froze. The man's words sent a chill down her spine. Suddenly, she remembered. Earlier that night, while watching Netflix, she had seen something move outside before they even ordered food. A shadow, a flicker, just for a second. But she had ignored it. Maybe it had been him. Snapping back to reality, Liz realized the door was now shaking violently. Maya dragged Liz upstairs into a bedroom and locked the door. The two girls huddled together, listening in terror. The man started pounding on the door, screaming for them to open it. The banging and his increasingly deranged voice sent chills through them. Overwhelmed with fear, Liz immediately called the police. All they could do was sit there, crying and praying for help. After what felt like forever, they heard police sirens. Finally, the man was caught. Liz and Maya were escorted out safely. The police informed them that they had found the body of a murdered pizza delivery driver. His uniform jacket had been stolen, used as a disguise. They had no idea what his true intentions were, but they were lucky. If Maya hadn't recognized him in time, they both might have been his next unfortunate victims. The hunter and the burialer in the forest. Kevin, a hunter, decided to spend some time alone in the vast, untouched forests of Arizona. As the sun set and he finished setting up his tent, the crackling fire was the only sound breaking the silence. However, the stillness of the forest was soon disturbed by something strange. During the night, Kevin began hearing whispers. At first, he dismissed them as natural sounds of the forest, but they grew louder, making it nearly impossible for him to sleep. As the hours passed and morning arrived, Kevin shook it off and ventured deeper into the forest. A hunter's instinct left no room for fear. While exploring the forest, Kevin saw a dirty shoe, half buried in the soil. At first, he thought it was just trash, but then he realized there were bones. Digging around, he found scattered bones, resembling a graveyard of death. He tried convincing himself they belonged to animals, but deep inside, he felt something far darker was happening here. As he moved on around midday, he found remnants of a torn piece of clothing dangling eerily from tree roots, emitting a foul, sickening odor. Kevin knew that if his suspicions were correct, if this was a crime scene, the killer would surely return. He decided to come back the following night, fully prepared. Kevin brought small, hidden cameras, the kind that could blend with leaves or be placed on high branches to capture footage. He also found a secure spot to observe without being seen. As night fell, Kevin retreated to his hiding spot. Hours passed in silence, with only the sound of insects chirping. Then suddenly, footsteps. His heart pounded as he listened to the rustling leaves and snapping branches. Someone or something was moving. Through the dim glow of the moonlight, Kevin saw a man emerge from the trees. He wore a dark hoodie, his face hidden in the shadows. He carried 2 large black garbage bags, dripping with moisture, perhaps another package. His movements were precise, methodical, as if he had done this hundreds of times before. He stepped into the burial site, crouched down, and glanced at a piece of paper, muttering something. It was the note Kevin had planted near the area. "I know who you are. Be careful." A bait to provoke a reaction from the killer. The man panicked, looking around frantically, his breath quickening as if he were afraid. He turned away and began leaving the area, following a narrow trail deeper into the forest. Kevin waited until he was far enough, then silently followed, stepping lightly like a hunter stalking its prey. The path grew increasingly difficult, surrounded by thick tree trunks. After about 20 minutes of walking, Kevin spotted an old, rotting wooden cabin hidden deep in the dense forest. The man's flashlight flickered inside. Kevin pressed himself against a nearby tree, trying to get a clearer view of what was happening. What he saw inside was far more horrifying than he had imagined. Blood-stained old clothes hung on a line, a table with scattered bone fragments, remnants of something he didn't want to think about. Then, a large freezer sat ominously in the corner, seemingly holding something inside. Kevin knew he couldn't confront this man directly. He looked dangerous, far from an easy match. Kevin realized he needed to stay sharp. Quietly, he placed one of his cameras just outside, aimed at the entrance. Then, he strung a piece of wire across the pathway. If stepped on, it would send a large branch crashing down, making a loud noise. Moments later, the man stepped out of the cabin, gripping a large knife. He took a few steps forward and triggered the trap. The branch came crashing down with a loud thud, startling him. In his panic, he stumbled over a tree root and fell hard to the ground. Kevin didn't hesitate. He quickly retreated, taking the recorded footage with him. Kevin didn't report to the police, but he had his own plan. The next morning, he posted a series of images from the scene on an online forum dedicated to mysterious disappearances, along with an anonymous message. The post spread quickly. People who had lost loved ones in the area took notice. An amateur search party decided to enter the forest and investigate. The killer realized he had been exposed. He tried to flee, but there was nowhere left to hide. Cornered and out of options, he lost control and ended his own life in the very cabin he once used as a hideout. Mysterious guest at the gas station. Kevin, working at a local gas station, was accustomed to the quiet routine of the night shift. This time, he was covering for someone else, starting from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. He sat behind the counter as heavy rain poured outside, with a major storm looming. Most people seemed to be staying indoors. After sitting inside for an hour, Kevin put on a raincoat and went outside to tidy up and prepare for the approaching storm. As Kevin gathered the last few items, he noticed a man not too far from the gas station. The man was pacing along the roadside, soaked to the bone. It was unusual, though it seemed he might just be waiting for a ride. 2 hours later, thunder began rumbling in the distance, followed by strong winds and heavier rain that shook the building. Realizing the intensity, Kevin rushed to lock the doors and moved to the storage room for safety. About 30 minutes into the storm, it took him several moments to realize that someone was banging on the front door. He left the storage room to check. Someone was outside, looking in and pounding on the door repeatedly. It was a man, and Kevin quickly rushed to unlock the door, thinking the man was in trouble and needed help. The man was soaked. He rushed inside without saying a word and began pacing back and forth across the floor, leaving puddles of water in his wake. Kevin tried asking if he was okay or needed help, but the man just stared with a vacant, hollow expression. Kevin thought it best to stay cautious and alert. The situation became uncomfortable. As the man paced around, Kevin realized he might be dangerous and decided to observe him patiently. The man's drenched coat revealed patches of mud and scratches, and there was a faint metallic smell of blood. His hand showed large, dark bruises. A gut feeling told Kevin that this man might have been involved in some violent incident. His appearance and behavior raised alarm bells in Kevin's mind. Though uneasy, Kevin decided not to escalate the situation, hoping the man would eventually calm down or leave. But the tension only grew as the storm intensified, leaving Kevin to think about his next move. The man seemed oblivious to everything, pacing around and mumbling incoherently. Occasionally, he cast strange glances at Kevin whenever he reached for his phone. Kevin noticed mud on the man's shoes and realized it was clay. He was familiar with it because customers often tracked it in on rainy days. It was a specific type of clay found near a construction site a few miles away. Kevin decided to act.
Would you like some coffee?
He asked, keeping his tone calm. At first, the man hesitated, then gave a slight nod. Kevin poured a cup and handed it to him. The storm outside seemed to be subsiding. While the man was distracted, Kevin quickly scribbled a note under the counter that read, "Call the police," waiting for an opportunity. Luckily, a delivery driver passed by and entered the store. Kevin discreetly signaled to him and handed him the note along with an item. The driver glanced at the note and nodded at Kevin before leaving. The man's behavior became more erratic. He started mumbling to himself. Kevin sensed that the man was on the verge of losing control. The man grew agitated, complaining about a woman who wouldn't stop screaming and how he had to make her quiet. Kevin pieced it together. The missing woman he'd heard about recently could likely be his victim. Kevin used the storm to create a distraction. When lightning struck and the lights flickered, he toppled a stack of metal shelves, startling the man. Amid the chaos, Kevin grabbed a wrench to defend himself if necessary. The man stumbled, spilling his coffee, and Kevin used the confusion to edge closer to the exit. Moments later, red and blue lights reflected off the rain-splattered windows. The police had arrived, tipped off by the delivery driver. The man tried to flee, but was quickly subdued. Kevin led them to the construction site. He deduced from the man's mud-caked, clay-covered shoes. There, they found the missing woman alive, though bound and hidden in an abandoned shed, relieved to see her taken to safety. Kevin stood in the rain, trembling. The storm had passed, but its horrors lingered. Kevin finished his shift in silence, home alone with a strange stalker. The house sat quietly in the suburban neighborhood, dark and isolated. The rain pattered against the windows, with occasional flashes of lightning hinting at an approaching storm, making everything feel more ominous than usual. Eva was watching a horror movie in the living room. Yet, every now and then, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, a part of her always feeling like something might be lurking behind her. After the movie ended, she went about her nightly routine, brushing her teeth, turning off the lights, and heading to bed. However, her peaceful sleep was interrupted around 1 a.m. when she heard a voice downstairs, calling her name. At first, she wasn't sure what was happening. The voice sounded oddly like her sister's, but Eva couldn't be certain, especially since her sister rarely came home. She got out of bed and walked down the hallway. The house was pitch black, the thick silence broken only by the sound of her footsteps. She entered the kitchen. The lights flickered, and Eva saw something. A knife lying on the kitchen floor, one she distinctly remembered cleaning and putting away earlier. She looked around, but no one was there. A few days later, she still hadn't shaken off the feeling. Eva tried to relax by watching TV, and at some point, she fell asleep there. While asleep, she heard a faint rustling noise. It seemed to be coming from the kitchen. A light flickered near the refrigerator. She cautiously approached. The The scene sent chills down her spine.
Lily?
She softly called, but there was no response. She moved closer. Her sister appeared to be sitting with her back to the refrigerator, eating something in an almost frantic manner. Something about the way she was eating felt off. She wasn't sure it was really her sister. Exhausted, Eva chuckled to herself, thinking perhaps her sister was just really hungry, trying to steady her trembling hands. She dismissed the thought, assuming it was her sister, and went back to her room, too tired to care. The next morning, before heading to school, Eva saw her sister. Eva asked her about the strange encounter.
Were you okay last night, Lily? Why were you home so late?
Lily looked surprised and confused, unsure of what Eva was talking about. She told Eva that she had worked the night shift and hadn't come home last night. Lily assumed Eva must have been sleepwalking. Eva froze. The woman she saw eating frantically in the kitchen wasn't her sister. But then, who was it? As usual, Eva finished dinner and began tidying up in the kitchen. Suddenly, the lights went out without warning. She stumbled in the darkness, trying to locate the light switch. As her hand reached out for the switch, she felt an icy presence standing behind her. A chill ran down her spine as she glimpsed a reflection in the refrigerator door. It was a figure resembling her sister, grinning unnaturally wide. She thought it must be a hallucination, a trick of her mind. That night, Eva struggled to sleep, tossing and turning in bed. Eventually, she dozed off, but was abruptly awakened by the sensation of the bed shifting beside her. Her eyes flew open in shock. She turned and froze. It wasn't a woman, but a man with a beard sitting on her bed. His lifeless eyes bore into hers as he spoke in a calm, haunting voice.
Eva, my sister.
Eva screamed and bolted from the bed. The man disguised as her sister chased after her, laughing slyly. She ran, desperate to escape. At the door, she fumbled with the handle in panic. Just as she managed to open it, he, still in his disguise, grabbed her arm and laughed triumphantly. Eva struggled, grabbing a lampstand from a nearby shelf and smashing it against his face. She fought her way free and sprinted to a neighbor's house for help. The neighbor helped her call the police, but when they arrived to take him away, he was sitting curled up in fear, then laughing inexplicably in Eva's room. The man, once in custody, confessed that he had been stalking her for a long time, hiding in the shadows. His trauma stemmed from a history of abuse. He had a compulsion to impersonate the people he encountered, believing he was becoming those he wanted to harm, including pretending to be Eva's sister. Eva and her sister finally found peace after the man was arrested, though the experience left emotional scars they could never forget. They comforted each other, knowing the nightmare was finally over. The deadly farewell. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as I walked through the sterile hallway of the hospital. I had worked here for years, the smell of antiseptic and the beeping of monitors ingrained in my senses. But lately, something felt different, something that always sent a chill down my spine. My patients came in all ages, but there was one little girl named Tira, perhaps the youngest patient in the hospital. Tira was a sweet child. She often wandered the halls and talked to other patients, though she was mostly alone. One night, while working a night shift, I was doing my rounds as usual. In the empty, long corridor, I heard two people talking softly. It was late, and all patients were supposed to be asleep. I followed the sound, which was coming from room 203. As I carefully opened the door to check, I saw her. Tira was standing near the patient's bed, smiling at me mysteriously and greeting me. But my sudden appearance didn't startle her at all. I reminded her that it was past bedtime and asked what she was doing there. She replied,
Nothing. I just came to say goodbye to George.
George was the patient in room 203. He had recently undergone major surgery. Though Tira seemed calm to me, I noticed George's face. He looked terrified and extremely pale. When I turned to remind her and take Tira back to her room, she had vanished as quickly as if she'd never been there. The next day, I went home around 4 a.m. after my night shift ended. It was my day off, so I slept the entire day. When I returned to work and walked past room 203, I thought about checking on George. But when I opened the door, I found a different patient. And I was informed that George had passed away the previous day. I stood frozen in the hallway, suddenly remembering when I asked Tira what she was doing in George's room. She said she came to say goodbye. But why goodbye? Shouldn't it have been good night? Something was very strange. Every time I encountered little Tira, I would find her wandering the empty hallways at night, talking to someone or entering a room. At first, I was skeptical, but I noticed that her presence seemed to coincide with the moments just before a patient passed away. Could she possess the strange ability to know when someone was about to die? Then I searched the hospital records. Tira wasn't listed anywhere. There was no information about her being admitted, and no legal guardianship papers on file. I was stunned. I gradually became obsessed with Tira's story and started investigating her background. My suspicions grew when I learned from a nurse that Tira had died in the hospital just a few months ago after falling down the stairs. However, the nurse insisted the incident was ruled an accident, and the hospital never made it public. My mind reeled. How could Tira still be here if she was dead? I started piecing things together, and a chilling thought struck me. Perhaps Tira's spirit was still lingering here. One day, when I dozed off at my desk, I saw her. She was sitting, crying in my dream. I slowly approached Tira. Tira turned to face me, her pale face and empty eyes brimming with a profound sadness. She said,
"I've been waiting for you, Dr. Cooper. You're the only one who can help me."
I stood frozen, the air thick with fear, or perhaps confusion. I asked Tira,
Help you? Tell me how.
Tira's ghost stepped closer, her small hand reaching toward me. She whispered painfully,
The experiment killed me.
I jolted awake at my desk, drenched in sweat from what I had seen. It was too real, like a cry for help. I knew I needed to act. I dug through old records, my hands trembling. I found it, just a copy, a part of a plan I'd never seen before. It all seemed to point to a dark secret. The deeper I delved into Tira's past, the more I realized her death was no accident. In reality, it was the result of an illegal medical experiment involving an unapproved drug to test the limits of human pain endurance and survival. Tira was selected as a test subject due to the influence of her adoptive father, a man working at the hospital as part of an underground network of unethical experiments. The drug used on Tira was untested and had horrifying side effects. Tira's death was the culmination of a cover-up to protect the hospital's reputation. One night, while working the night shift at the hospital, I heard strange noises, like a child crying, coming from the abandoned wing of the hospital. The sounds led me down a hallway that hadn't been used in years. My heart pounded as I pushed open a door, revealing a forgotten room. Tira stood there, her figure faint in the dim light, her eyes filled with sadness and pain. She told me that she couldn't leave, and that she had been trapped in the hospital ever since her death. Her spirit was tethered to the hospital, bound to the hallways, unable to move on until the truth about her death was revealed. Tira had guided other souls to the afterlife, but she herself was trapped here. When I made my final efforts to reveal the truth, the hospital management and the girl's adoptive father tried to discredit me, even going to great lengths to silence me by threatening my career. The hallways were empty, the hospital eerily silent. I walked through them, knowing they were trying to stop me. But I didn't falter, and I was determined to report everything to the authorities, ensuring that those responsible would be held accountable. As the authorities investigated, I stood in a patient's room, moonlight streaming through the window. I saw the silhouette of a little girl standing behind me. It was Tira, appearing now in a more peaceful form. She smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude. She thanked me, her voice gentle, as her figure began to fade away. Tira's departure finally brought clarity. The hospital faced public outrage, and the administration was forced to shut down. Her adoptive father was arrested for his involvement in the illegal experiments, and justice was served. Although Tira's ghost was gone, the darkness of the hospital remained, reminding me that the line between life and death, between justice and illegality, is often much thinner than we imagine. The strange man in the snow. Last winter, I went to a small cabin owned by my uncle in Mountain Valley. I finally reached the cabin after a long 3-hour drive, the tires crunching on the frozen ground. Stepping out of the car, the cold bit through my coat. Almost immediately, a boy around 15 or 16 years old ran out of the cabin. He was young and smiling. His eyes looked tired, as though he hadn't slept in days. He took my luggage and guided me inside. I stepped inside the cabin. It was simple and rustic. A fireplace stood in the corner, with wood neatly stacked beside it. The boy explained how cold it got at night, his voice unusually calm. I told the boy I would go skiing and asked if he could prepare dinner for me while I was out. He nodded with that strange smile. I dressed in my ski gear, excited to hit the slopes. I began skiing through the forest, where all the trees were bare. Halfway down, snow started falling, thick and fast. I took a break and walked toward a large tree. Suddenly, a faint growl echoed in the air. I froze. Standing next to the tree was a man looking up at the sky, his face covered in falling snowflakes. His neck was unnaturally long, and his shoulders jutted out at odd angles. He didn't move at all. This man was unsettling. I quietly stepped back, avoiding sudden movements so as not to disturb him. I just wanted to get back to the cabin. I stepped cautiously, but accidentally crushed a twig underfoot. A loud snap broke the silence. The man looked down, his eyes glowing like those of a wild animal. Blood was smeared across his mouth, and his right hand clutched a dead rabbit, its belly torn open. The man wiped his mouth with his other hand and smiled wickedly. Panicked and frantic, I bolted through the forest, snow crunching under my boots. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if he was following. I burst through the cabin door, slamming it shut behind me. I quickly locked it. The teenager noticed something was wrong. He came out of the kitchen, and I shouted to call the police immediately. He calmly replied, "There's no service here, sir." I checked my phone, and he was right. There was no signal. "What's going on, sir?" the boy asked. I realized I couldn't tell the boy the truth about the man. I didn't want to scare him. So, I lied and said I had heard wild animals in the forest. After a while, I calmed down, embarrassed by my overreaction. Perhaps I had exaggerated it too much. While having dinner, the lights suddenly went out. A heavy snowstorm had started outside, and I could hear the windows rattling from the fierce wind. I wondered where the boy was and realized I never knew his name. Suddenly, I heard footsteps crunching on the snow outside. I slowly turned my head toward the large window. Near the fireplace, the light illuminated a bloodied hand pressed against the outside of the living room window. His bloodied hand was pressed against the glass. It was the man I had seen in the forest. His face was pressed against it, smearing blood across the surface as he grinned, staring directly at me. The man's mouth gaped open, his tongue licking blood around his lips. His unblinking eyes were fixed on me. Then the boy walked in, as if he had been hiding, and looked at the man through the glass. He wasn't scared, he was almost amused. His smile mirrored the man's grin. "That's my father," he said. I froze for a moment, then grabbed the car keys off the wall. I flung open the front door and ran barefoot into the storm. I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from the cabin. The boys' laughter followed me into the night. I hurried to the car, driving for 2 hours, barely able to see through the snowstorm. I didn't stop until I reached the next hotel. Once I was safe, I called my uncle. His answer sent chills down my spine. What boy? There's no caretaker at the cabin. No one else is supposed to be there. Horrified, I realized I had spent hours in that cabin with complete strangers. The next morning, I reported it to the police. They went with me to the cabin. It was empty. My belongings were gone, and the cabin was spotless, as if no one had ever been there. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what those people wanted, but I would never stay in an isolated cabin again. Stranger at the campsite. A woman, Lena, in her 20s, stood at the edge of the familiar trail leading to her campsite. Her hiking backpack was slung over her shoulders, and a neatly rolled up tent was strapped to it. She breathed in the fresh air, savoring the tranquility of nature. Lena had been camping here for years, escaping the monotony of her small town. The forest was her refuge. Lena moved forward, following the trail leading to the lake. The setting sun filtered through the trees. She felt at home here, but today, a strange unease crept into her chest. As Lena rounded the corner and arrived at the clearing by the lake, her heart skipped a beat. Standing near the water's edge was a man. He appeared to be in his 40s, wearing regular swim trunks and a faded white t-shirt. His small tent was already set up, not far from where hers would be. He was staring out across the lake, his back turned to her. Lena hesitated for a moment. She usually camped alone, and seeing someone else here made her feel uneasy. With a slight shrug, she moved a little further from his tent and began setting up her own. She gathered large stones, arranging them into a neat circle to prepare for her campfire later. As she was absorbed in her work, she noticed movement. The man was no longer facing the lake. He was staring directly at her, standing eerily still. Lena's heart raced. She tried to ignore him, focusing on her campfire. But every time she glanced up, he was still there, motionless, his eyes locked on her. Her discomfort grew. She awkwardly raised her hand and waved. Maybe he was just being polite. Maybe he wanted to say hello. But after a moment of silence, the man simply turned and walked along the shore without acknowledging her. Lena frowned. Something about him didn't feel right, but she shook off the thought. She grabbed a chair and sat by the shore, determined to relax and enjoy the view. Hours passed, and the sun began to set. Lena packed up her chair and returned to her campsite. She started a campfire, hoping to relax after the strange encounter. As she stared into the flames, her eyes drifted toward the tree line. A figure stood in the distance, partially hidden behind a tree. Lena squinted, trying to make sense of the shape. It was the man in the white shirt. He had returned, standing there, watching from a distance. Lena quickly shifted her chair to the other side of the fire so she could face him. Time passed slowly. The man stood frozen in place as the forest around them grew darker. The shadows deepened, and soon, his figure became blurry, blending into the trees. Even though it was dark, Lena knew he was still there. He could see her clearly, illuminated by the fire, but she could no longer see him. Fear gnawed at her. What was he doing? Why hadn't he returned to his tent? Hours passed, and Lena remained tense, staring into the trees. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and distant crickets. She considered leaving but feared the man might follow her, keeping her rooted in place. She stoked the fire, ensuring it burned brightly, knowing it was her only way to keep the surrounding darkness at bay. Lena sat by the campfire, her face blurred in the flickering firelight. The night was already thick with shadows. The forest around her was a pitch-black void. Her eyes continuously turned to the tree line where the man stood. Even though she could no longer see him, she knew he was still out there, following, waiting. Suddenly, a tree branch broke nearby. Lena stiffened, her breath caught in her throat. She looked around her camp, squinting into the darkness. Perhaps he has already arrived. The flames cast long, flickering shadows. Lena couldn't stop imagining shapes moving among the trees. There, at the edge of the tree line, someone was probably standing there because she always heard footsteps crunching through the forest. Then slowly, the man's silhouette appeared. She regained her determination, suddenly stood up, picked up a thick branch from the fire, and held it as a weapon. The man didn't flinch. He remained still, watching her as if waiting for her next move. Lena shouted into the darkness, her voice trembling but firm, asking who he was and what he wanted from her, but there was no response. The man tilted his head slightly, as if confused by her defiance. Lena's skin prickled with fear. She gripped the burning branch tightly and stepped closer to the edge of the campfire, ready to defend herself. But then, without warning, the man turned and walked into the forest. Slowly, cautiously. His footsteps were eerily soft. Lena watched him go, not daring to follow. He disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the trees, but the tension in the air didn't lessen. She didn't believe he was truly gone. The night dragged on. Lena struggled to stay alert, her body heavy with exhaustion, her mind clouded with fear. The fire had burned down, casting only a faint light. Despite her best efforts, her eyes began to droop. She couldn't fight it any longer. After only a short while, Lena was startled awake by a faint sound, her eyes snapping open. The fire was nearly out. Only a few embers remained. The air was cold and damp. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure if she had imagined the sound. But then she heard the faint rustling sound again, this time coming from behind the tent. Lena's heart raced. She stood up slowly, creeping carefully to avoid making any noise. She grabbed a nearly burnt-out branch from the fire, gripping it tightly. She cautiously walked around the tent, following the sound. The rustling grew louder as she approached the back of the tent. Lena tightened her grip on the branch. She took a deep breath and rounded the tent, only to find a squirrel nibbling away. The area behind the tent was empty. Lena frowned, confused. She could have sworn she heard something like footsteps. She returned to the fire, scanning the surroundings. The first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. Lena's body was stiff from sitting for hours, her eyes heavy from the sleepless night. It seemed like she was very lucky. For some reason, the man never returned, and she saw no sign of him for hours. But the insecurity is still there. Lena quickly packed her things, wasting no time. She glanced nervously at the tree line. The forest remained quiet and still, as if the events of the previous night had never happened, and she wished that were true. She slung her backpack over her shoulders and began walking briskly toward her car. Her legs trembled. Every rustling leaf or snapping twig made her jump, but the trail remained empty. As Lena neared the parking lot, she began to feel a sense of relief. She could see her car up ahead, the only vehicle in sight. She quickened her pace, eager to leave the forest and the strange man behind. But as she reached the clearing, she froze in her tracks. His tent was still there. She slowly, cautiously, walked toward it. The tent flap was slightly open, the inside dark, but there was nothing there. Lena backed away, her mind racing. What kind of game was this? Was he even real? She snapped out of it and hurried toward her car. She slammed the door shut, her hands trembling as she started the engine, and drove off. As Lena sped down the winding road, she glanced into her rearview mirror. Standing at the edge of the forest, partially hidden by the trees, was the man in the white shirt. His hand was raised, thumb out, as if hitchhiking. Lena pressed the gas pedal harder, her car speeding away, and she never looked back or returned to that forest again. It left her with an unforgettable memory, perhaps the worst camping trip she'd ever had. The house of the lost child. It was 2006 when my family moved into this house. My parents decided to quit their jobs and start anew in the countryside. I was just a child then. But something about this house struck me immediately. The first thing I noticed when we moved in was the stairs. Every time I passed by, I would see a shadow silently moving up and down. It never frightened me. In fact, it felt oddly familiar. I was 6 years old, but I could always see things that others couldn't, and this house was no exception. I didn't tell my parents right away, not because I was scared, but because I felt that presence meant us no harm. Still, I was very afraid of the dark. My room was upstairs while the bathroom was downstairs. Every night, before going to bed, I would use the bathroom to avoid facing the fear of going down the stairs alone at night. But one night, my mother's voice woke me. She called out to me, angrily and irritably, telling me to come downstairs and not to run around anymore. I sat up in bed, confused. I hadn't run at all. In the following days, I kept experiencing similar incidents. My mother often scolded me for running around the house, accusing me of mischief. I had told her many times that I hadn't done it, but she never believed me. Then one night, the power went out, and we were almost engulfed in darkness, lit only by a few flickering candles in the living room. As we sat together, I saw it again, a shadow. It swayed back and forth, hovering over the sofa. My mother didn't see it, but I did. That presence was very strong but had no malice. That night, as we lay in bed, my mother and I heard a voice, soft yet clear as day. "Mom, where are you? I'm cold." That voice belonged to a child, and it came from just outside our bedroom. My mother looked at me, eyes wide with fear. As I grew older, I began to understand that the shadow wasn't there to harm us. It wasn't a ghost trying to scare us, but a lost child searching for something. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that spirit was looking for its mother. I had a friend who could sense things like I could, and they suggested that I tell the spirit to move on. So one quiet afternoon, I stood in the living room and said to the air, "I believe your mother loves you very much. You can move on. It's time to go to a happier place." The house felt different afterward. The shadow disappeared. The footsteps stopped. No more voices at night. I thought that the spirit had finally found peace, or perhaps it needed to validate something because it had been left here and unable to move on in this house. In 2018, my aunt, Tita, who had worked abroad, returned home to retire. One evening, we sat together in the living room, sharing stories. We talked about the strange occurrences that had taken place in the house over the years. I told her about that spirit, about how my mother had once mistaken it for me because it looked like a small child. I explained how I had ultimately helped it move on. As I was speaking, I noticed something. Tita, she's crying. She started telling me a story I had never heard before. Long before I was born, my grandmother, she was pregnant with Aunt Tita. Not long after that, there was a baby boy. She named her son Angelo. Suddenly one day, Grandma left and didn't come back. At that time, Aunt and Angelo were too young to know what to do in this remote suburb. So, Angelo lay on the sofa. The boy was sick and passed away in his sleep while clutching a small glass jar that his mother had given him. He was only about 3 to 4 years old. At that time, my aunt was too young to understand what was happening and thought her brother was just sleeping until one day a neighbor came and took the boy to a small coffin and buried him. Our new house sits on this land. Perhaps the boy could not move on because he was waiting and didn't know when his mother would return. Sometime later, my aunt, the boy's sister, passed away just after we talked about him. Now, standing in front of the house, I can't shake the feeling that something has changed. Then came the unmistakable sound of soft footsteps. They echoed from the hallway behind me, moving toward the stairs. I turned around, breath caught in my throat. The shadow had returned. As I climbed the stairs, I saw the shadow standing right above and sliding into my bedroom. Upon reaching the room, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and just as I was about to turn it, I heard, "Mom, where are you?" I slowly pushed the door open, the creaking hinges filling the silent house. The room was bathed in the faint light of the moon filtering through the window, casting a cold glow over everything. My heart skipped a beat as I saw Angelo. This time, he was not just a shadow. He stood in the middle of the room, a small, frail figure, unmistakably a child. His head was bowed down. Then slowly, Angelo lifted his head, and for the first time, I saw his face. A face with deep-set eyes filled with sorrow. His mouth opened, and in a voice that sent chills down my spine, he whispered, "Mom, where is she?" I wanted to tell him, to explain that she had passed away. But before I could say anything, he raised a small glass jar, looking at it as if it held an ominous energy imprisoning his soul. Angelo stood still, clutching the jar, looking at me with hollow eyes. I had to do something. I couldn't let Angelo remain trapped forever. I took a deep breath, my voice trembling as I finally spoke to Angelo, telling him that his mother was no longer here. I told him to always believe that she loved him, so I urged him to move on. For a moment, Angelo's expression softened, but then he tightened his grip on the jar. His voice rang out again, firm and more desperate. "Where is my mom? I want to see her." As if he didn't believe the words I was saying. Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized there were no words that could satisfy him. He wasn't just seeking peace. He wanted his mother, and nothing else mattered more than that. I could feel the air shift, the temperature drop, and for the first time in years, I felt fear. I couldn't let him stay. I had to help him find peace. Without thinking, I stepped toward him, my hands trembling. "Angelo, I can help you find her. But first, you need to let go, to release everything." His gaze shifted from the jar to me, his hollow eyes filled with confusion and longing. Slowly, very slowly, he began to loosen his grip on the jar. As it fell from his hand and shattered on the floor, the room went silent. Angelo's figure began to fade, dissolving into the moonlight. Before he disappeared completely, I heard his voice one last time, soft, almost a whisper, "Thank you." I stood outside the house. The weight that had burdened it for years was gone. Angelo was finally free. The feeling of guilt lingered, but I knew I had finally helped him find the peace he had been searching for all these years. The love his mother had for him, the love that had anchored Angelo to this world, had freed him. Perhaps he was beginning to understand the painful truths that even I never wanted to hear. He would likely continue his journey to find his mother in another world where he truly belonged. I looked back at the house one last time. It no longer felt haunted. Now, it was just a house, quiet and still. Angelo had gone, but he left behind something much more enduring. It was a son's love for his mother, transcending the boundaries of life and death. The Blonde Girl. This is a story that happened a long time ago when I visited my local library. I have always been drawn to the lonely silence of old libraries. The air inside was heavy with the smell of old paper and dust, and the walls were lined with towering bookshelves that. I remember that I went there to borrow a few educational books. The internet existed at that time, but you couldn't just Google anything you wanted to know. The more conventional method for me was to go to the library and check out books on the subjects I was interested in. Anyway, I drove to the library, which was only about a 5-minute drive from my house. I walked in just as the library was about to close. I thought I was the only one in the library. As I walked through the aisles, my footsteps echoed softly on the wooden floor. The daylight outside was fading, casting long, strange shadows through the narrow windows. The library was quite large, and I headed to the section of books I was looking for. I felt immersed there. The silence was pleasant, only occasionally broken by the rustle of turning pages. I started looking for the best books to borrow. I spent a few minutes browsing and comparing the books. As evening approached, I decided to look at a particularly intriguing book I had found on spirituality, the supernatural, and horror. It was the only one on the shelf, and I picked it up. Some passages of the book talked about a blonde girl who had been brutally murdered, horrifically, by ancient cursed legends. She was like a sacrificial offering. Just as I was about to leave, a chill ran down my spine. I glanced over my shoulder and saw her, a blonde girl standing in the far corner of the library. She was partially obscured by the shadows, the light fading dimly. There was something unsettling about her presence, an eerie silence that seemed to absorb all sound around her. She seemed almost out of place. This woman appeared quite young, with blonde hair, wearing a polka dot headband as if from many decades ago. My heart began to race. The girl didn't move, her gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I hesitated, unsure whether to call out to her or quietly leave. As I watched, the girl took a few small, slow steps forward, revealing a pale, emotionless face. Her eyes were dark voids, empty and soulless. I felt a wave of terror wash over me, paralyzing me with fear. The girl took one step closer, then another, moving silently across the floor. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. She moved closer, her movements deliberate and haunting. When she was just a few meters away, she stopped and tilted her head to one side, as if studying me. Finally, I found the strength to move. I slowly backed away, my eyes never leaving hers. The girl remained still, staring at me with her empty, terrifying gaze. I turned and hurried towards the exit, clutching the book tightly. The oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of my footsteps echoing through the library. Then, suddenly, whispers grew louder, as if speaking directly into my ear, a mixture of voices seeming to come from everywhere. I looked around frantically but saw no one, and I couldn't determine their source. The library, once a sanctuary of knowledge, now felt like an abandoned house. As I fled, the whispers followed, growing more insistent. Panicking, I turned back, but the door had vanished, replaced by an endless corridor of bookshelves. The whispers were now deafening. I clutched the ancient book to my chest. I could see her clearly. The girl stood just inside the threshold, her black eyes sewn shut. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, as if cursing. Her face was grotesquely distorted, and she was holding a box containing something that looked like 2 eyes. I reached for the door and flung it open, the cold night air hitting me like a physical blow. As I made my way to the exit, I glanced back one last time. In the corner where the girl had stood, I saw a lock of blonde hair lying on the floor, glinting in the sunlight. The whispers had vanished, but the haunting feeling remained, a reminder that some secrets are better left undiscovered. I never spoke of what I saw that night. Sometimes, as I lay in bed, I was reminded not to mention the girl. She would scream, tears that couldn't fall because she had no eyes. If I spoke, she would be in danger for being exposed. Perhaps we had made a spiritual connection. She looked so pitiful. I didn't know what else to do but go to the church and pray for her. 2 months later, the dreams began to fade, and I rarely saw her in my sleep anymore. Perhaps it was a good thing for her. Ghosts in the warehouse. I am a warehouse worker for a small business in my city. I just do certain tasks that need to be done each night. I unload the goods that are delivered and place everything in its proper place. Most of the time, I just wear headphones and listen to music while I work because the warehouse isn't too big. It's rare for someone else to be working overnight with me. The night drags on slowly. The warehouse is eerily quiet, with the only sound being the creaking of the old building. My shift started at 10 o'clock, and there were perhaps some knocking sounds between 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock a.m. I stopped, took off my headphones, and tried to listen to the sound again, but it had stopped. As I returned to work, the knocking resumed, this time louder, more persistent. I froze, facing the source of the sound, a narrow, dark aisle flanked by towering shelves. The knocking stopped when I reached the aisle, leaving only darkness. As I neared the front of the warehouse, I noticed the front door slightly ajar. Confused, I recalled that I had locked it when I arrived. I walked up and pushed the door open, finding the latch broken. I quickly locked the door again, this time jamming a nearby metal bar against it for extra security. But the gesture felt futile. Determined to finish my shift, I returned to my duties, but my focus was shattered. Every creak of the building, every flicker of the lights felt like a warning. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered and went out, plunging the warehouse into darkness. I pulled out my flashlight to cut through the blackness. The beam revealed only empty aisles, but the feeling of being watched lingered. As I moved through the warehouse, the flashlight caught fleeting glimpses of shadows darting out of sight, too quick to be fully seen. My fear surged as I raced towards the front door. I saw the metal bar I had wedged into the door bent and twisted. I turned to face the darkness, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The light revealed a tall, indistinct figure watching me from the shadows. I started breathing rapidly. The figure moved slowly towards me, its footsteps echoing loudly in the silent warehouse. In a last desperate act, I threw the flashlight at the figure and dashed into the darkness, hoping to find another way out. My frantic sprint led me to the back door of the warehouse, but just as I was about to escape, the door slammed shut, as if someone from behind had done it. I panicked and turned around, but as I was about to run back, my flashlight suddenly flickered back on, illuminating a reflection of myself in a large mirror hidden behind some old boxes. But it wasn't me. A darker version, with a blurred face, slowly raised its hand, moving while I stood frozen. It seemed to be hypnotizing me, trying to pull me somewhere. It said, "Follow me," and then gave a terrifying smile. I stumbled, too frightened to think, and grabbed the door handle, yanking it with all my strength, then ran outside, gasping for air as the fog seemed to swallow me whole. As I ran, I heard footsteps again, echoing through the mist. I turned around, but the warehouse was almost invisible through the thick fog. I collapsed to the ground, exhausted, as I turned back to face whatever was chasing me, but there was nothing there. I pulled out my phone and called the police, trembling with fear. When they finally arrived, they thoroughly searched the warehouse, but found no trace of an intruder. If I hadn't realized the door was broken, I would have faced that strange thing directly, with no way of knowing what would have happened. Although unlikely, I can't shake the feeling that it's still chasing me. So I quit the job, hoping I'll never encounter it again. The man passed through the door. It was a quiet evening. Abby was home alone as usual. Her mother often had to work 2 jobs in one day, from morning to late at night. So Abby had to take care of herself most of the time, and she was used to it. The house was peaceful. Her mother wouldn't be home for hours, so she took care of everything herself, from cooking to locking up, getting ready for bed. Before going to bed, Abby planned to relax a bit. She sat on the couch, ready to watch TV with a tub of ice cream in her hand. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. She froze, spoon of ice cream halfway to her mouth. It was strange her friends never visited this late, and her mom always used her key. Confused, she slowly walked to the door. She wasn't exactly scared, just curious. She opened the door and saw him a man. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking on. He was bald, wore thick glasses, and had a scruffy beard with dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't seem threatening, but something felt off. Abby greeted him, and the man smiled and asked, "Hello, little girl. Are your parents home?" At the time, she didn't think much of it, assuming it was just a friendly question. So Abby foolishly answered that her mom wasn't home. A smile spread across his face, but then she started to feel uneasy as his questions grew too interested. He smiled and said, "Good night. Don't get into any trouble," then walked away. Abby didn't understand what had just happened, so she closed the door. Her heart was racing, but she pushed it aside. He was just being friendly, she told herself. Abby returned to her ice cream. Her mind replayed the conversation. Something about the way he had looked at her and smiled made her feel uneasy. 10 minutes passed, and she began to feel comfortable again. The strange encounter faded from her mind. Then, there was another knock at the door. She thought it might be him again. This time, something told her to be cautious. She wasn't sure why, but before opening the door, she decided to lock the chain. When Abby opened the door, the chain caught, preventing it from opening fully. And there he was, the same man from earlier. His eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, he pretended to be friendly again. He stammered a greeting to Abby again, and said he just wanted to make sure she was okay. To her, he no longer seemed friendly. He looked desperate, as if realizing he hadn't gotten into the house and was trying to cover it up. Abby gave a quick thank you out of fear and slammed the door shut, her hands trembling as she locked it. She stood there, frozen, staring at the door. Minutes passed, and she couldn't stop thinking about the man. But every sound, every creak of the house made her jump. She needed her mom and wished she were home. Suddenly, she heard the man's voice again. this time coming from the mail slot of the front door. He was whispering through the slot, saying he wanted to come in and had something to tell Abi. Abi froze in place. She screamed, "Leave me alone." The mail slot slammed shut, and then the pounding on the door started. He was banging hard, rattling the doorknob violently, shouting crude words demanding she open the door. She stumbled back, tears streaming down her face, silently praying he wouldn't get in. The banging grew louder, more frantic, as he tried to force the door open. For what felt like an eternity, Abi stood there, sobbing, and then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Perhaps the man had given up and left. She didn't move, only standing there, listening. About 30 minutes later, Abi's mom came home. The door opened, and she rushed in, finding her daughter in tears. Abi told her everything. Her mom immediately called the police about the incident, but they didn't find any trace of the man. As Abi lay in bed that night, she couldn't stop thinking about how lucky she was to have used the door chain. It was a small, almost insignificant decision, but it had saved her. Train through time. At a train station, as some people hurriedly catch the last train home, among them is Leah. As the train departs the station, Leah sits down in her seat, looking out at the city skyline fading into the distance. She feels a strange sense of unease, though she cannot understand why. The rhythm of the train is steady, almost hypnotic, lulling her into a gentle sleep. The soft rumble of the train fills the air as it speeds along the tracks, the city gradually giving way to darkness. Leah is startled awake as the train sways slightly upon entering a long tunnel. Inside, the tunnel is pitch black, and the train's lights flicker momentarily. Leah looks around, noticing that the once crowded train car is now eerily empty. She glances out the window, but instead of seeing the countryside she expected, there is only a vast, empty void, as if the train is traveling through an immense, empty space. As the train exits the tunnel, Leah is shocked to see an entirely different scene outside. The modern city and familiar countryside have vanished, replaced by a mist-covered, ancient village. The buildings are old and crumbling, with thatched roofs and cobblestone streets. The train slows down as it approaches a station that appears to have never been used. The train stops, and the sliding door opens with a faint hiss. Leah hesitates, but the strangeness inside the train compels her to step outside. As she steps onto the platform, the cold, damp air hits her, filled with the smell of earth and decay. The village is deserted, with no signs of life. The only sound is the cawing of crows. The village looks like a snapshot from the past. Tables are set with dust-covered plates, untouched. A child's toy lies abandoned on the street. She realizes that she is no longer in her own time. Perhaps she has traveled back to a long-forgotten era. Suddenly, Leah hears a sound like a train whistle, and panic overwhelms her. She runs back to the platform as the village around her begins to change. The sky darkens at an unusually rapid pace. As soon as she reached the platform, the train began to accelerate, the doors still open. With a desperate leap, Leah grabbed onto the railing and pulled herself inside, collapsing onto the floor of the train car, where she lay, gasping for breath. As the train sped away from the village, Leah slowly stood up and looked out the window. The village was quickly swallowed by the darkness. The train entered another tunnel. She braced herself for whatever might come next. When the train emerged from the tunnel, Leah was stunned to see a different scene. This time, the train was traveling through a futuristic city filled with towering skyscrapers and strange objects floating in the sky like giant bubbles. The train glided smoothly through the city, and she realized with growing horror that the train was not taking her home, it was carrying her through different eras. She was trapped in a time loop. Finally, The train began to slow down again, this time approaching a station that looked familiar. But something was wrong. Everything was slightly off, like a distorted reflection. Leah hesitated, unsure if she had truly returned to her own time. The station was eerily quiet. She stepped off the train, heart pounding, and looked around to see the station just as she remembered it. As the train pulled away, Leah watched it disappear into the tunnel, leaving her standing alone on the platform. She started to walk towards the exit, but stopped when she noticed something on the ground. She picked it up and was startled to see that it was an old, intricately decorated pocket watch with strange symbols engraved on its surface. The hands of the watch were spinning rapidly, as if caught in a never-ending cycle. The train may have brought her back, but perhaps she was still trapped in this loop. Maybe it would soon return to take her on another journey.
Two children without eyes. The setting sun cast long shadows over the quiet suburban neighborhood. Ivy, a young woman in her 20s, was walking home after work. The streets were unusually empty, and the air carried a strange chill. As she turned the corner, she noticed two figures standing under a flickering streetlight. They were children, a boy and a girl, around 8 or 9 years old. They stood unnaturally still. Ivy whizzed. Steps slowed as she approached them, a growing sense of unease with each step. But it was the only way for her to get home. The children simultaneously turned their heads, and Ivy's breath caught in her throat. Their faces were pale and expressionless. But what struck her most were their eyes, or rather, the absence of them. These children had smooth, empty voids where their eyes should have been. The eye sockets were dark and hollow, an abyss that seemed to pull at her very soul. Ivy's heart pounded as she stopped a few steps away from them. The boy and girl began to move, their movements unnaturally stiff. They stepped towards her, their empty sockets somehow feeling like they were staring menacingly. Ivy wanted to run, but her legs felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The children reached out, their hands pale and cold. They lightly touched her, sending a chill through her body. As their fingers met her skin, images flooded Ivy's mind. She saw dark hallways, old, decaying houses, and a profound sense of sadness and fear. The disjointed images, like mismatched puzzle pieces, kept flashing through her mind. Suddenly, the children let go, and the images stopped. Ivy stumbled back, gasping for air. The boy and girl stood there, silent and still. The flickering streetlight cast eerie shadows on their faces, making their hollow sockets appear even darker. Ivy ran, her heart pounding. She didn't stop until she reached her home. Slamming the door shut, she leaned against it, trying to calm her frantic breathing. The encounter had left her shaken, and the images from those children still lingered in her mind. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the eyeless children and the haunting images they had shown her. She knew she had to find out who they were and what had happened to them. The next day, Ivy returned to the spot where she had seen the children, but they were gone. She began asking around the neighborhood, describing the children to anyone who would listen. Most people shook their heads, saying they had never seen or heard of such children. But an old man at the local library seemed to know something. His eyes widened in recognition when she described them. He told her about a tragic accident that had happened many years ago. 2 children had died in a fire at an old house that once stood on the very street where Ivy now lived. Their bodies had been found, but their eyes had mysteriously gone missing. The house had been abandoned and eventually demolished, but it was said that the children's spirits still haunted the area. Ivy felt a chill run down her spine as the old man spoke. She realized that the images she saw were the children's memories, their plea for help. Determined to soothe their spirits, she decided to search for the remnants of the old house. It took many days of searching, but she finally found it. It was a patch of overgrown grass, hidden behind a row of new houses. As she stood there, she felt a presence around her. The air grew colder, and she knew the children were near. Ivy knelt down and began to dig. She uncovered charred pieces of wood, the remains of the old house, and then she found a small, scorched box. Inside were 2 porcelain dolls, their eyes missing. Ivy's heart ached as she realized these were the children's cherished toys. With trembling hands, she placed the dolls back in the box and whispered a prayer for the children's souls. The air around her seemed to lighten, and she felt a gentle breeze brush her face, as if in thanks. Relieved, she knew she had done the right thing. The eyeless children were no longer bound to their tragic past, and perhaps she had helped them find their way to the afterlife.
The Stranger's Chase at Dunkin' Donut. It was just another regular shift at Dunkin', where I work part-time. The night shift is my usual shift, and tonight was no different. We usually close at 9 p.m., and I've grown used to the quiet that settles over the store as night falls. We had to clean up everything, and my coworker hadn't shown up yet, but that wasn't unusual. I was fine handling the store by myself. The inside of this Dunkin' was larger than most, with a few booths and tables scattered around. I had spent the last few hours in silence. No one had come in, and the last customer had left by 8:30 p.m. With only a few minutes left until closing, I walked around as usual, wiping down tables and making sure everything was tidy. As I passed by, heading back to the counter to clean up, something made my heart race. I hadn't noticed him before, but there was a man crouched down, almost hiding in the corner, completely out of sight from behind the counter. Everything seemed to freeze as his eyes locked with mine the moment I saw him. For a second, neither of us moved. The man slowly stood up. He was of average height, skinny, with messy hair and disheveled clothes. I asked him if he was okay, my voice trembling as I tried to stay calm. He didn't respond right away, mumbling that he was fine. I reminded him that we were closing and he needed to leave. He nodded and started walking toward the door. For a moment, I thought everything was fine, but then, without warning, he turned around and sprinted toward the counter with a crazed look on his face. Everything happened so fast. He didn't head for the door. He ran straight behind the counter, his eyes locked on the cash register. I began to realize what was happening. Without hesitation, I made for the exit, my mind racing. I didn't care about the cash register. I just needed to get out. Guys like him are dangerous, and they usually carry weapons. I had to be smart about this. But before I could reach the door, his voice rang out, loud and threatening. He shouted, his voice filled with anger. Stop. Froze for a second, but instinct kicked in, and I kept moving, my heart pounding in my chest. I pushed the door open and ran out, without looking back. I thought he would be inside to rob the store, but I was wrong. He chased after me, running through the parking lot, and fear gripped me like never before. I looked around the area, but most of the stores were dark and closed. I spotted a gas station in the distance, its lights flickering like a beacon of hope. I ran faster, my breath quickening, and he was still behind me. The distance between us seemed to shrink. I burst into the gas station, my chest heaving with each breath. It was the closest place still open. As I ran inside, I shouted for someone to call the police. My voice was panicked and full of fear, echoing through the empty space. The clerk behind the counter and a lone customer turned to look at me. Startled, I ran past them, heading straight for the back of the store. A small restroom sign caught my attention. My fingers fumbled with the lock as I rushed inside. The flickering light in the small restroom, combined with the smell of bleach, heightened my tension. I was shaking uncontrollably. Leaning against the door, I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I reached into my pocket, my hands trembling as I pulled out my phone and called the police. The dispatcher reassured me that officers were on their way, but the minutes felt like hours as I waited. I pressed my ear against the bathroom door, listening for any sign of him. Nothing. The silence was suffocating. Was he following me? Was he out there, lurking? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong and that whatever awaited me outside wasn't over. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly unlocked the bathroom door and peeked outside. The gas station was eerily silent. The cashier was no longer behind the counter, and the customer had disappeared. I cautiously stepped out further. The dim lights cast long shadows over the shelves. I walked carefully, my own footsteps suddenly too loud. My eyes darted to the door, but there was no sign of the man outside. For a brief moment, a wave of relief washed over me. Then I saw him. Through the glass window, his face appeared pale and terrifying. His wild eyes pressed against the glass like something from a nightmare. His eyes locked onto mine, a twisted smile spreading across his face. He smiled grotesquely, almost stretching from ear to ear. Then he breathed onto the glass, writing the word "run." It felt like a challenge, daring me to try escaping. He slowly dragged his finger down the window, the screeching sound sending chills down my spine. He was waiting, like a predator, knowing that eventually I would have to come out. Panic surged within me again. I rushed toward the back exit, hoping it would lead to some way out. As I pushed the door open, I found myself outside again, this time in the alley behind the station. My breath fogged the cold air as I frantically looked around for somewhere to hide. The alley was narrow, with tall brick walls on either side, dark and unwelcoming. A few trash bins lined the path, but it was mostly empty. I had to make a choice. The only way out was forward or back to the gas station, where he might be waiting for me. I didn't have time to think. I started running, my body moving on instinct. As I ran, I glanced over my shoulder, nothing behind me. Still, fear gripped me tightly. This alley too dark, too unknown, leaving me vulnerable to whatever could come. I turned the corner and was met with a dead end. My heart sank as I saw the towering chain link fence blocking my way. I could hear my own breath, ragged and loud, and feel the cold sweat on my skin. Maybe there was no way out. Footsteps echoed behind me. Slow. Maybe he was coming closer. My body froze in place as the sound grew louder, the rhythm unsettling in its calmness. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. My back pressed against the cold brick wall as I realized I had no other choice but to face him. He appeared at the end of the alley, his eyes locked onto mine with that twisted smile. His steps slowed as he moved into the faint light, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the ground. In his hand, he held an iron rod. My heart was pounding in my chest. My legs were shaking. Then he spoke. "You can't run forever." His voice was low, mocking, and dragged the iron bar across the road with screeching sounds. My mind seemed to be spinning. I scanned the alley, desperately searching for anything that could help me. Without thinking, I grabbed a broken brick lying near the trash cans. I knew it wasn't enough to stop him, but I had no other choice. It was all I had. He stopped just inches from me, smirking. "You really think that's going to stop me?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. As he took one more step toward me, I swung the brick with all my strength. In the moment, he was too focused on taunting me. Turning away smugly, I threw the brick, and it hit him square in the head. For a second, everything froze. He staggered back, the smile vanishing from his face as blood trickled down his forehead. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I seized the moment and ran. I didn't look back. All I could think about was getting as far away as possible. The sound of sirens tore through the night air in the distance. The police were coming, but I didn't stop running. Right then, the screech of tires cut through the air as police cars appeared. 3 patrol cars pulled into the gas station, red and blue lights flashing furiously. I could see the officers jump out, guns drawn, moving with urgency. I tried to shout, trembling as I pointed toward the alley. "He's over there." The officer nodded quickly and signaled to the others. They disappeared into the alley, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they shouted commands. The man appeared at the mouth of the alley, running toward the parking lot. But this time he wasn't alone. The police were right behind him. His wild eyes darted in every direction as he desperately searched for a way out, but he was surrounded. The police quickly tackled him to the ground. The man struggled violently, his voice twisted with rage, sending chills down my spine. But now, I was truly safe. The flashing lights of the police cars began to fade as I sat on the cold sidewalk, trying to piece together everything that had happened. It was over, but the horror still lingered. Nightmare neighbor. The old, tall apartment building stood under the dim glow of the streetlights. It was late, and most windows were dark. Rena was standing outside, staring up at the second floor. Her floor. She had lived here for a few months, and the place had always been quiet, until Arthur moved in next door. Rena's apartment was at the end of the hallway on the second floor, and taking out the trash usually only took a few minutes. But tonight, she felt as though someone was watching her. As she was about to turn the corner at the end of the hallway, he was there. Arthur was standing by his door, looking as though he had been waiting for her. He always found excuses to talk and stand uncomfortably close to Rena. She lowered her head, quickly murmured a greeting, and walked toward the stairs. This time, he said nothing. Goosebumps rose on Rena's skin. Something felt different tonight, making her more uneasy than before. Rena entered her apartment and quickly shut the door. She took a moment to calm herself, telling herself she was overreacting. She turned off the lights in the living room, planning to lie in bed and watch TV. It was late, and she was tired, but she wasn't ready to sleep yet. As she walked past the broom closet, she heard a faint sound, a soft rustling from inside. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze, staring at the closet door. With trembling hands, she reached for the closet door handle. She hesitated. Then she pulled the door open. Arthur was in there, inside her storage closet. For a moment, time seemed to stop. He was just there, staring at her, unblinking, with a twisted smile on his face. He stepped forward, crawling out of the closet like a predator closing in on its prey. She gasped, stumbling backward, unable to believe what she was seeing. She ran into her bedroom, slamming the door shut. But she didn't have time to lock it. The door burst open, and Arthur was right there, his face wild and unhinged. She dashed toward the bathroom, the only place left to hide. She slammed the door shut just as Arthur reached the bedroom. Her hands fumbled with the lock. Rena's back pressed against the cold bathroom wall. Her breaths came in quick gasps as Arthur pounded on the door, trying to break through. The thin wooden door was the only thing separating her from the man who had been stalking her for weeks. His sickening grin etched deeply into her mind. Thankfully, she had her phone. She clutched it tightly, her fingers trembling as she spoke to the police. Her voice was barely a whisper, strangled by the fear gripping her. Arthur pounded on the door again, the wood splintering under the force. Rena knew it couldn't hold much longer. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. She held her breath, pressing her ear to the door, straining to hear any sound. She didn't know if he had left. Had he given up? Arthur stood outside the bathroom door, his eyes wild with anticipation. His patience had run out. His hand hovered over the doorknob. He knew she was cornered, with nowhere to escape. He slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, gleaming knife. His fingers tightened around the handle. Nightmare neighbor. With a single powerful kick, the bathroom door splintered. The door burst open, and Arthur lunged inside, his eyes wide and feral. She backed away, nearly pressing herself against the wall. She screamed at him to stay away, but Arthur didn't stop. He lunged at her, grabbing her arm with a bruising grip. Rena struggled to pull away, but he was too strong. Pain shot down her spine as he twisted her wrist, pinning it against the wall. Her phone slipped from her grasp, falling to the floor. Arthur's face was only inches from hers as he hissed threats, blaming her for always ignoring him when they crossed paths in the hallway. Rena struggled, trying to break free, but he pulled her closer, squeezing tighter. His knife swiped through the air, grazing her arm. She gasped as a sharp pain tore through her skin, leaving her injured and bleeding. The sound of sirens pierced the night air, growing louder as the police rushed toward the apartment building. The flashing lights reflected on the window, like a beacon of hope in the stifling darkness. Inside, Rena's vision blurred with panic and pain. He shoved her against the wall again, laughing maniacally as he brought the knife closer to her neck. Her free hand flailed, fumbling along the counter by the sink and the shelves, searching for anything she could use to defend herself. She grabbed a glass soap bottle and, without thinking, smashed it against Arthur's head. The glass shattered, and he staggered backward, momentarily dazed. Arthur stumbled, and the knife slipped from his grip, falling to the floor. Rena didn't wait. She bolted for the door, clutching her bleeding arm. She fled the bathroom and into the living room, her mind screaming for escape. But Arthur wasn't far behind. Blood streamed down his face from where the glass bottle had struck him. Enraged, he grabbed the knife from the floor and charged toward her. The police stormed the apartment complex. They knew they had to act fast. Rena reached the living room, but her legs gave out, sending her crashing to the floor. She could feel Arthur's looming presence closing in, the knife still in his hand. His eyes were now filled with rage, the twisted delight in them gone. He reached for her, grabbing her hair. Rena winced in pain, struggling to get up, her body screaming for help. Arthur growled,
"There's nowhere left to run, girl."
Just as he raised the knife again, the apartment door burst open with a loud crash. The police stormed into the apartment, cutting through the tension. Arthur stubbornly held on to her, refusing to let her go. Seizing the opportunity, Rena stomped on his foot, making him cry out in pain. She ran toward the police, gasping for breath, blood dripping from her arm, but the nightmare was over. Rena sat on the edge of the ambulance, her mind still reeling, her body in shock. She watched as the police loaded Arthur into the back of the car. The flashing lights of the police car faded into the night as they drove away. The ghosts in the fog. Tonight, like every other night, I drove my truck down a desolate rural road, taking a sip of coffee to stay awake. The road stretched ahead, cloaked in a thick fog that clung to my headlights. The stillness was eerie. No cars, no animals, just the hum of my engine and the faint crackle of the radio. I considered stopping to wait, but decided to keep going. Moving felt safer than sitting in the dark. A faint smell wafted in, like something metallic. At first, I thought it was just the engine, but it grew stronger, sour and rotten, mingled with the scent of decaying bone. It was stifling, worse than anything I'd ever smelled. I rolled up the window, but the stench lingered, filling the truck like a living thing. My stomach churned violently, and I pulled over to the side of the road. I stumbled out of the truck, gasping for fresh air, but the stench clung to me, lingering in the air. Unable to bear it any longer, I began vomiting. Once I was done, I quickly covered my nose as the smell still hung thick in the air. As I straightened up, I noticed movement ahead, a figure limping across the road, slow and deliberate. The figure was a man. He wore a torn white shirt and black trousers, the fabric old and frayed. I froze, watching him cross the road, oblivious to the faint presence of my truck. His head was slightly bowed, his face obscured by the fog. I climbed back into the cab, intending to approach him. As I drove closer, my headlights illuminated the road ahead, revealing more figures emerging from the fog. All dressed in old-fashioned clothing, moved disjointedly. They limped in unison, heads bowed. They didn't seem to notice me or each other, moving toward the darkness on the other side of the road. I kept driving. Then, from the same direction, a smaller figure appeared, a child, maybe in their early teens. The dense fog surrounded him as he stood motionless on the road, head bowed. Uneasy, I thought the boy might need help. I stopped the truck and stepped out once more. I approached him. "Do you need help?" I called, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. The boy didn't respond. Instead, his body remained unnaturally still, his head bowed like a puppet with its strings cut. A heavy silence blanketed the road. I swallowed hard and took another hesitant step forward. Suddenly, the boy's head snapped upward with a jerky motion, the crack of his neck loud enough to echo in the stillness. His face was pale and vacant. I stumbled backward as he tilted his head, as if studying me. Then an impossibly wide mouth opened, a gaping maw that hissed a single word.
"You won't escape!"
Before I could react, he lunged forward, his icy hands clamping around my leg like a vise. He tightened his grip further. I kicked desperately, trying to break free. Pain shot through me as my knee hit the road. I clawed at the ground, panic surging through me. With all my strength, I yanked my leg free and scrambled backward. My hands and knees burned from the sharp gravel, but I didn't care. All I could think about was escaping. The boy stood and started running toward me, his arms flailing and legs bent at unnatural angles. I stumbled toward the truck, with him right behind me. I dove into the cab and slammed the door shut, fumbling with the lock. His scream was deafening, shaking the truck's windows. His grotesque face, with its gaping mouth, pressed against the windshield. His hands slammed against the glass, leaving smears of something dark and viscous. Trembling, I turned the key and slammed my foot on the gas. The truck lurched forward, throwing him off the hood. His twisted body writhed as he stood back up. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the road, surrounded by other nameless figures emerging from the fog. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the fog growing thicker. They stood motionless, watching as my truck sped into the darkness. The road stretched ahead through thick fog. I couldn't stop thinking about the faceless figures I'd seen before. Days had passed since I escaped the boy in the fog. Their hollow presence, the way they lunged toward me. It felt like they were still out there, just beyond the reach of my headlights, waiting for me. But I couldn't turn back. My delivery had to be made, and this was the only road. Then that smell hit me again faintly at first. Metallic, but quickly turning into a stench, sharp and rancid, like rotting meat. My stomach twisted as I tried to breathe through my mouth, but it was no use. Ahead, my dim headlights illuminated an old sign by the roadside. It swayed lightly in the wind, its paint cracked and faded. Danger, though at the time, I had no idea of its significance. My headlights flickered briefly, catching the silhouette of a figure in the distance. I slowed the truck, squinting to see the figure more clearly. It was a man, limping across the road, his form distorted by the fog. I hesitated, unsure whether to stop. Then another figure appeared, and another. All of them moved in the same direction, heads bowed, their movements unnervingly stiff. I continued driving slowly, keeping my distance. The figures kept crossing, oblivious to my truck, disappearing into the fog on the other side. I gripped the wheel tighter. "Just people," I muttered, trying to calm myself. "Just people." Then my tires hit something wet and slippery, causing the truck to swerve. I slammed on the brakes, and then I saw it. A black, wet streak stretched across the asphalt. I stepped out of the truck, the freezing air biting at my skin. The stench hit me, a wave of nausea roiling my stomach. Ahead, the trail led to the carcass of an animal, its body decayed and rotting. Flies buzzed frantically around it, staining the road with wide, dark streaks. I was about to leave, but then something caught my attention farther down the road, shapes moving in the fog. A group of people stood by the roadside. Their movements were strange, unnatural. The next sound that reached me was growling, and perhaps chewing, as if they were gnawing on something. The fog thinned enough for me to see them clearly. I didn't know what they were, but they resembled the things I had seen before, only much more terrifying. Horrifying hollow cavities gaped on their faces and bodies, oozing a black, tar-like fluid. Some of them hunched over another animal carcass, gnawing on its remains with clawed, deformed hands. My gasping breath broke the silence. Then their movements suddenly slowed to a halt. For a moment, I froze, and the others followed suit, all raising their heads in unison. They were looking at me. Then they began running, charging toward me. Their bodies twisted and contorted, their growls morphing into frenzied screams. They were faster than I imagined. I stumbled, fumbling for my keys as I turned back toward the truck. The keys slipped from my hand and fell. I was only a few steps from the truck when something grabbed my leg. I fell hard, hitting the ground. One of them had grabbed my leg. My foot was slick with its slimy grip. In a moment of desperate panic, I twisted and kicked with all my strength to break free. I staggered to my feet and bolted for the truck. I slammed on the gas, speeding away from those grotesque creatures. I didn't stop. My hands ached. The road stretched ahead, silent. In the rearview mirror, all that remained was an empty highway. I swore I would never take that road again. I silently thanked whatever force had kept me alive. Late night passenger. When I was younger, chasing money at all hours of the night seemed necessary. I picked up a side job as an Uber driver. The job wasn't glamorous, but driving around the big city was something I enjoyed. Every day after 5 p.m., I'd grab a quick bite and begin my Uber shifts. Most nights ended around 2 a.m. This story took place on one of those long nights, about 6 months after working 2 jobs simultaneously. There was a hospital downtown with a large parking lot. It became my regular spot to take short naps while waiting for rides. It was quiet, away from the city noise. That night, after hours of driving, I went there to rest. I didn't plan on sleeping long, just a 15-minute nap. When I woke up, I couldn't remember where I was for a few minutes. I glanced at the dashboard, and only 15 minutes had passed. My music playlist was still playing, soft and mellow. I checked my phone, hoping I hadn't missed any ride requests. That's when I saw it. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of something that made my heart stop. A man was suddenly sitting in the back seat. He was right behind me, just staring. Then he smiled, a creepy, unsettling grin. I turned to face him, and sure enough, he was there. He looked disheveled, his clothes torn and dirty, and he only wore one shoe. His face was grimy, and he seemed exhausted, like he had been on the streets for a while. Something wasn't right with him. I didn't know how long he had been there, how he got in, or what he wanted. I glanced at his hand, and there it was, an open phone displaying the Uber app. My mind started racing. Maybe he had wandered out of the hospital, saw my car running, and thought it was his ride. I tried to stay calm. "Hey, are you waiting for a ride?" He didn't respond right away. His eyes darted from the roof of the car to the floor, avoiding my gaze. I pointed to his phone, hoping he understood. I asked again, "Do you need a ride?" He nodded. The gesture was slow, cautious, and uneasy. I forced a smile and told him I'd take him where he needed to go. I tried to act normal, to ease the tension in the car. But deep down, something about this man wasn't right. I left the hospital parking lot, following his vague directions to an old, closed-down music venue downtown. Then it hit me. I hadn't accepted a ride request on the Uber app. This guy wasn't my passenger. I glanced at the rear-view mirror again. His phone didn't show any ride request. He wasn't connected to me at all. I spoke, trying to keep my voice calm. "I just realized this ride hasn't been registered. Can you find me on the app quickly?" That's when his entire demeanor changed. He scoffed, looking out the window, then turned to me with a cold expression, saying he wasn't going to pay for the ride. I nervously chuckled, hoping it was a joke, but he remained silent. The atmosphere in the car grew tense. I glanced at him again and noticed a hospital discharge bracelet on his wrist and a dirty backpack beside him. I was trapped in the car with a homeless drifter who must have snuck in while I was asleep. I needed to get him out. I told him I wasn't giving him a free ride across town and that he was lucky I hadn't called the police. But before I could grab my phone, he lunged and wrapped his hands around my neck. His hands were rough, calloused. I struggled trying to pry his fingers off, but he was too strong. A stench emanated from him. I could barely breathe. Instinct kicked in, and I slammed my foot on the brake. The sudden stop sent him flying forward, loosening his grip just enough for me to break free. I swerved toward the curb. He was dazed. I shifted the car into park, dialed 911, and honked the horn. He groaned, recovering from the impact, and started coming at me again. But this time, I wasn't powerless. I screamed into the phone, describing everything as fast as I could. Then, as if he realized the game was over, he grabbed his backpack and bolted out of the car, vanishing into the night. A few blocks away, the police caught up to him. I watched as they cuffed him. Later, I found out he had escaped from the hospital after being admitted for an overdose. He wasn't just a drifter, he was dangerous, and I had escaped something terrible. As the night came to a close, the only thought in my mind was, I'll never forget to lock my car doors again.